Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I went hiking alone a few weeks ago. I don't usually go alone, but I've done this trail before, and it's a pretty straightforward loop. About 15 miles, not too steep, and mostly through the woods. I started early in the morning, just after sunrise. There were a few cars in the lot, but the place is never crowded. I figured I'd be done before the afternoon. About 2 miles in, I stopped to tie my boot. That's when I first saw him. He was maybe 100 feet back on the trail, just standing there. Black jacket, jeans, ball cap. Nothing weird, really. He wasn't looking at me, just off into the woods. I figured he was just taking a break or waiting for someone. I kept going. A little while later, I stopped to drink some water. When I turned around, he was there again, same distance back. He wasn't walking, just standing in the middle of the trail. Same spot, like he hadn't moved. I got that feeling in my stomach, like when you miss a step on the stairs. But I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was a slow hiker, or maybe he liked taking breaks. I didn't want to make a big deal out of nothing. I pushed on. After a few more miles, I came to a clearing with some big rocks. I sat down to eat a granola bar and rest for a minute. When I looked back down the trail, he was there again. Still far enough away that I couldn't make out much of his face. Just standing, not walking. He didn't have a backpack, which was odd for a hike this long. He wasn't looking at me, but he wasn't looking at anything else either. Just standing there. I got up fast and kept going. My heart was beating hard in my chest, but I told myself it was fine. He hadn't done anything. He wasn't following me, not really. He was just there. Around the halfway point, the trail loops back toward the parking lot. It's thicker in the woods there, quieter. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, but I didn't see him. I started to feel better, even a little silly. Maybe I just spooked myself. I made myself stop checking so much. About 7 or 8 miles in, I needed to pee. There's a little stream off the trail, so I went down behind some trees. When I came back up to the path, I saw him again. Closer this time, maybe 50 feet. He was half hidden behind a tree, like he'd stepped off the trail too. He wasn't moving. Just standing still, like he'd been there the whole time, waiting. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling out, asking if he was okay, but something in my gut told me not to. I didn't want him to know I'd seen him. I walked faster, trying to act like I hadn't noticed. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my water bottle and didn't even stop to pick it up. I kept walking, forcing myself not to run. My legs were burning, but I didn't stop again. Every time I glanced back, he was there, always just far enough away to make me second-guess myself. He never got closer. He never got farther. Just stayed exactly at that distance. The last few miles were the worst. I didn't see him anymore, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was there. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no wind. Just my own footsteps and the sound of my breath. I kept thinking about how he never carried a pack, never drank water, never even shifted his weight. I practically jogged the last mile. When I saw the parking lot through the trees, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I thought maybe I'd just imagined the whole thing, or maybe he turned off somewhere along the trail. But when I got to my car, There were only 2 other vehicles left, mine and an old silver sedan parked at the far end of the lot. I didn't see anyone around. I sat in my car with the doors locked, trying to calm down before driving off. That's when I saw him again. He was standing at the tree line, just far enough away that I couldn't make out his face. Still. Not moving. Just watching. I peeled out of there so fast I nearly hit the curb. I kept checking my mirrors the whole drive home. I haven't gone hiking alone since. Me and Emily went camping last summer, deep in the woods, far from any campgrounds. We wanted quiet, just the 2 of us. No cell service, no people, just trees and the sound of a river nearby. We hiked in for hours, picking a spot off the trail where no one else would be. The first night was perfect. We had a fire going, cooked some food, listened to the woods. It was peaceful. In the morning, we packed up a little and decided to explore. We didn't plan to go far, just to see if there were any better spots by the water. We found the other campsite maybe 15 minutes away. It was wrong. At first, it looked abandoned. A small clearing, flattened grass, a fire pit. But as we got closer, we saw the fire wasn't out. It was low, just smoldering, but still burning. A tin pot sat on the edge of it, something thick and dark stuck to the bottom. There was a backpack leaned up against a tree, half unzipped, a jacket draped over a log. Emily called out, but no one answered. I walked over, looking at the stuff. A can of food sat open on a rock, a plastic fork stuck inside. The food was fresh. Not days old, not left behind and forgotten. Whoever had been here was just here. But where were they? Emily stayed by the trees, arms crossed. She didn't like it. I didn't either, but I told myself there was a reason. Maybe they went to get water. Maybe they were gathering firewood. I walked to the tent. It was zipped closed. I hesitated, then knocked on the top like a door. Hey, anyone in there? Nothing. I knelt and tugged the zipper. Empty. Sort of. There was a sleeping bag, half unrolled. A flashlight lying on its side. A book with a folded corner like someone had just put it down. A pair of shoes. I stepped back. Something was wrong. No one leaves like that. Not with food still warm, fire still burning, everything in place. Emily shifted from foot to foot. We should go. I nodded. I didn't like the feeling I had. Like we'd walked into something we weren't supposed to see. I turned, about to leave, when I noticed something. The woods around the campsite were quiet. Too quiet. No wind. No birds. No rustling in the trees. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I looked at the ground. There was only one path leading away, pressed down grass and broken twigs. I followed it with my eyes, but it curved into the trees, out of sight. That's when I noticed something else. Footprints. Fresh ones. Leading away from camp. But none coming back. Whoever left hadn't returned. A branch snapped. Not far. Emily grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my skin. We didn't speak. We didn't move. Another snap. Closer. We turned and walked fast. Not running. Not yet. But moving, hearts pounding, ears straining. Behind us, the sound started again. Not animal sounds. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Slow. Not matching our pace. Following. Emily was breathing fast. Someone's there. I know. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We kept walking, faster and faster until the path blurred under our feet. The footsteps followed. I don't know how far we went before we saw our camp. We practically ran the last stretch, grabbing our bags, shoving things inside without packing properly. I stomped out our fire with shaking hands. And then we left. We didn't hear anything after that. No footsteps. No snapping branches. Just the sound of our own breathing, ragged and panicked, as we made our way back to the trail. Hours later, when we finally reached the car, Emily turned to me. Her face was pale. There were no footprints coming back, she whispered. I didn't say anything, because I had been thinking the same thing. Whoever had been at that campsite had left. But something else had stayed. I've been an avid hiker for years, and I've been planning this solo trip for months. I wanted a day away from the city, just to clear my head. I picked a trail I'd never done before, one that wound through a quiet part of the woods. The day was cool, the sky clear, and I set off with nothing more than a small backpack, my phone, and a water bottle. About 2 hours in, when I was deep in the woods and the trail was mostly shaded by trees, I spotted something hot out of the corner of my eye. Lying against a large pine was a small black box. As I got closer, I saw it was a little camera, zip-tied to the trunk with a few pieces of rough string. The lens was pointed right at the trail. I stopped, heart pounding, wondering who would do something like that. I looked around, but the woods were quiet. No one was in sight. I shook my head and thought, maybe someone left it here to catch wildlife or something. But the way it was hidden and tied so neatly didn't feel natural at all. I took a few steps back and scanned the area. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a prank? Or was someone watching hikers? I decided to keep going, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I kept glancing back now and then. The rest of the trail was not far, and soon I reached a bend. That's when I saw another camera, about 100 yards further down the path. It was set up in a similar way, zip-tied to a birch tree, pointed directly at the trail. I stopped in my tracks. My pulse was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I walked slowly toward it, not sure if I wanted to inspect it further. I held my breath and reached out a trembling hand, then pulled it away. I wondered if someone was following me, or if this was a setup. I took a few pictures with my phone, trying to document what I saw. The more I walked, the more I noticed. Every now and then, tucked into a tree or hidden behind some branches, was another small camera, each one placed to record the trail. They weren't many, but enough to send a chill through me. I stopped and sat on a fallen log, staring at the trail ahead. I tried to think of a logical reason for this. Were these cameras left by the Park Service? But I had never seen anything like this on other trails. I'd been hiking in these woods before, and nothing like this had ever happened. I started to feel a deep sense of dread. The idea hit me, someone was tracking hikers. They had to be following, maybe even recording us. I kept thinking about who would do that and why. I remembered stories on the news about criminals using hidden cameras to spy on people, but I never thought it would happen here, on a trail I trusted. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, deciding what to do next. Part of me wanted to call the police, but I was afraid they'd say, "There's nothing wrong here." Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but I still wanted to get home safely and know what was going on. I pulled out my phone, and after a few moments of hesitation, I dialed 911. When the call connected, I told the dispatcher, I'm hiking on a trail in County Name. I think someone is spying on hikers. I found hidden cameras tied to trees. I explained everything in a shaky voice. The dispatcher said they would send an officer to check the area, but that I should stay on the line until help arrived. I stayed by the log, eyes darting to the trees. After what felt like forever, I heard the distant sound of a car engine. I saw headlights cutting through the trees along the road bordering the woods. The dispatcher's voice came through my phone, telling me that an officer was on the way. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. About 15 minutes later, I saw a patrol car pull up near the trailhead. I flagged down the officer and told him everything. He listened carefully and drove back into the woods with me, following the trail where I had seen the cameras. He took his time, checking the first camera. He said he didn't see any signs of tampering or recent disturbance on it, which only deepened my unease. He walked further along the trail with me. In a clearing, he found a notebook wedged between two rocks. It had notes in it, a few scribbled names, dates, and locations. One of the entries mentioned good day for filming, a date, and target, hiker on trail. My heart sank. This was not a random act. Someone had been planning this. The officer called for backup, and soon 2 more officers arrived. They collected the cameras, took the notebook as evidence, and started questioning me about what I'd seen. I gave them every detail I could remember. They said they'd start an investigation immediately. I was still shaking when I finally made it back to my car, but I drove out of those woods as fast as I could. A few days later, I got a call from the local police station. They told me that they had traced the cameras to a small operation run by a man who worked alone. He had been using the trail to pick up footage of hikers, maybe to sell to someone, or to use for his own twisted purposes. The officer told me that he had been arrested after a neighbor reported strange activity near the woods. They found his van loaded with similar cameras in a nearby storage unit. I never went back to that trail again. I don't know how many people might have been affected or how far his recordings went, but I was just glad I got out safe. I still think about that day every time I drive past a wooded area. I still wonder how many eyes were watching, how many footsteps were hidden among the trees. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I can't help but feel that I'm being watched just a little bit. I've never been one for camping alone, but after a rough breakup and a lot of work stress, I needed some time away from everything. So last fall, I rented a spot deep in the woods, a quiet, remote area far from any town or other campsites. I set up my small tent on a flat patch of ground under a canopy of trees and settled in for what I thought would be a peaceful night. That first night was almost perfect. I sat by a small, crackling fire, cooked a simple dinner, and listened to the quiet sounds of the forest. I slept fitfully, though, because my mind kept wandering. I woke a couple of times, but it always turned out to be just the wind rustling the branches. I convinced myself it was nothing. But on the second night, things felt different. I don't remember exactly when I woke up. It could have been around 2 a.m., but I was lying in my sleeping bag when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound like someone breathing. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest, and it wasn't a moan or a snort. It was just quiet breathing, right outside my tent. At first, I thought it must have been my imagination or maybe my heartbeat playing tricks on me. I lay there, frozen in the dark, my heart pounding, listening. The breathing was steady, as if someone was standing still. I tried to tell myself it was the wind moving the leaves or some animal, but deep down I knew it didn't match any animal sound I'd heard before. I spent what felt like an eternity in that state. I wanted to look, but I was too scared to unfasten the zipper or peek out. I kept my eyes shut, trying to will myself back to sleep. Eventually, the sound faded away into silence. I didn't know if it was gone or if it was just waiting for me to stop worrying. I finally fell back asleep, though I hardly slept. When morning came, light filtered through the canvas and I felt an odd chill that I couldn't shake off. I slowly unzipped the tent and stepped out, still feeling the weight of the night. As I stretched and looked around the clearing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Around the edge of my tent, in the thin layer of dew and dust that had settled overnight, were small bare footprints. They weren't my size, they looked delicate, as if made by someone with small feet. The prints circled the tent, coming in and out, as if someone had walked around it several times during the night. I knelt down to examine them, my hands trembling. They were clear and fresh, as if made only hours before. I scanned the area. There was no sign of any other tent or any footprints leading away from my spot. I was alone, at least as far as I could tell, and yet someone had been there. My mind raced. I thought about the quiet breathing I'd heard and now these footprints. It was like someone had been watching me in the dark, creeping around my tent when I was too scared to move. I didn't see any tracks that led to a path or any clear trail that could be followed. The prints just circled my tent and then stopped abruptly. I felt a chill run down my spine, not just from the cold morning air but from the realization that I was not as alone as I thought. I gathered my things quickly. I packed up my sleeping bag and tent as fast as I could, all the while glancing nervously over my shoulder, expecting to see someone hiding behind the trees. Before leaving, I decided to call the park ranger. I explained what had happened, the faint breathing I'd heard at night and the bare footprints around my tent that did not match my own. The ranger told me that there had been some reports of a local hiker known to roam near the campsites, someone who was often considered a troublemaker and who had been seen in the area before. He said the man might have been just wandering around and that the footprints were likely his, but he warned me to be careful. He promised to send someone out to check the area later that day. I drove home, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I never went back to that campsite after that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, that I had been marked in some way. The experience left me paranoid for months. I would always check behind me when hiking and never camped alone again. I still don't know if the man meant any harm or if he was just a lost soul wandering the woods, but that night changed everything for me. I learned that even in a place meant for peace, you never really know when someone else is lurking just out of sight. And that is something I will never forget. It was late October when my friends and I decided to go camping in a remote part of northern Maine. We were looking for a break from the city, a chance to get away and enjoy some quiet time under the stars. We found a clearing deep in the woods, far from any road or other campsites, and set up our tents. I still remember the chill in the air that night and the crackle of our campfire as we sat around, laughing and telling stories. About an hour into the night, as the fire died down a bit and we settled into a comfortable silence, I noticed a flicker of light in the distance. At first, I thought it might be another group of campers, but the area was supposed to be deserted. I mentioned it softly to Mark, one of my friends, and we all turned our eyes toward the distant glow. In the middle of a small clearing about a mile away, a single campfire burned steadily. Sitting by it was a man. He was alone. He didn't appear to be doing much, just staring into his fire, almost motionless, as if lost in thought. His face was hard to make out in the low light. He wore a dark jacket and his hair was messy. There was something unsettling about the way he just sat there silently while the flames danced in front of him. We watched him for what felt like hours, our conversation slowly dying down as the strange scene took over our attention. I couldn't tell if he was aware of us or if he was completely oblivious. Mark joked a little that maybe he was a hermit or someone with nowhere else to go, but deep down, I felt a growing sense of unease. As midnight turned to the early hours of the morning, something shifted. Without any sound, the man stood up. We saw him leaning close to his small fire, and then he carefully pressed his hand against the flames until they died out. It was as if he had finished whatever he was doing. The sudden extinguishing of his fire made the darkness even thicker, and for a long moment, nothing moved except the sound of our own breathing. Then we saw him start to walk. He didn't run or rush, he simply began moving in a straight line from his spot toward our campsite. At first, we sat there, frozen. I could feel my heart pounding and my palms getting sweaty. The way he moved was deliberate, his silhouette barely visible against the dark woods, but every step he took was aimed directly at us. I whispered to the group, "We need to get out of here." Mark and the others exchanged glances. Some of them wanted to stay and see what he'd do next, but I was already picturing all kinds of dangerous possibilities. There were no other campers around, no voices or laughter, just that single man approaching in the dark. We didn't wait. We started packing our things in almost total silence, our movements jittery and fast. I kept glancing over my shoulder at that distant figure, now just a dark shape among the trees, coming closer with each passing minute. When we finally loaded everything into the car, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw him standing at the edge of the clearing. He didn't look angry, but his expression was impossible to read in the darkness. All I knew was that he was following us. We drove off as fast as we could on the rough road, not daring to look back. The whole drive was a blur, our hearts were still racing, and no one said much. We eventually made it back to town, and I haven't gone camping alone ever since. Later, I asked around about that spot, about whether anyone else had seen someone there. No one had. The clearing we had camped in was remote, with no history of visitors. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure, that night was the scariest experience I've ever had. I learned that sometimes the quietest nights hide the darkest secrets, and it's best to leave well enough alone. I'm safe now, but every time I pass a dark, empty clearing in the woods, I can't help but think of that solitary campfire, the man who sat in silence, and the cold realization that sometimes you're not as alone as you think. I'd been driving for hours on a long day trip through the state park. I planned on stopping at a remote area for a quick break and a bathroom visit. I was already tired and just wanted a quiet place to use the restroom. I pulled off on a gravel road that cut through the park and parked by a small building that looked like a rest area. It was old and plain, with a single door and no lights on outside, only the occasional flicker of my car's headlights. I got out, locked my car, and walked over. The building looked abandoned, almost as if it hadn't been used in years. I pushed the door open and stepped into a small restroom. The air inside was stale, and the walls were painted a faded green. I didn't see any signs of recent use, except for a couple of paper towels and a dusty dispenser. I closed the door behind me and used one of the stalls. The whole place was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. After I finished, I stepped out into the main room. I was the only one there. I decided to wash my hands at the sink by the window. I turned on the faucet and splashed some water on my face. As I was drying my hands, I noticed something strange. The door behind me had closed with a soft click. I remembered that there was no lock on the inside, no latch that I had seen. I walked over to it and tried the handle. It was still in the same position as when I had entered. I frowned and turned back to the sink for a moment. Then, as I reached for my phone to check the time, I heard it, a quiet, deliberate click that sounded like the door had been locked from the outside. I spun around and pressed my ear against the door. There was nothing but silence on the other side. I tried the handle again. It wouldn't budge. My heart started to pound, and I whispered, "Hello," as if speaking to someone might break the silence. I called out again, louder this time, "Hey, is someone there?" Still nothing. I pressed my hand against the door and tugged hard. It didn't move at all. I checked my phone. The battery was low, but I managed to send a quick text to a friend, telling him I was at the park and that something didn't feel right. I didn't hear any response yet. I paced around the small room, my mind racing. I thought about how I'd come here for a quick stop, and now I was trapped in this old park restroom. I moved closer to the door, trying the handle again, now jiggling it back and forth, but it was as if it had been sealed shut from the outside. I pressed my face to the cold metal and shouted, "Please, if anyone's out there, help me." There was no reply, just the sound of my own echo. I pressed my ear harder against the door and heard nothing except the quiet drip of water from the faucet that I had left running earlier. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. I recalled that when I first came in, there was no lock. That meant someone had come after I had entered and deliberately locked the door. My mind raced with thoughts. Was this some kind of prank, or was someone trying to trap me here? I tried to force the door open with all my strength, pushing and pulling, but it held firm. I moved away for a moment to collect my thoughts. The room was dimly lit by a small window near the sink, and outside, through that window, I could see only darkness and a few bare trees swaying in the wind. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I sat down on a small plastic stool near the sink and tried to call 911. My hands trembled as I dialed the number. The line rang a few times before I heard a voice. 911, what's your emergency? I stuttered, I'm in a park restroom. I can't get out. The door is locked. I explained as best as I could that I was alone and that I believed someone had locked me in from the outside. The operator said they would send help and asked me to stay on the line. I could barely hear my own breathing as I waited. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. I listened to the distant sounds of the park, the rustle of leaves, and my own heartbeat. I kept calling out to anyone who might be outside, but there was no response. My friend finally texted back, telling me they were on their way. I clutched my phone tightly, trying to remain calm even though fear was rising in me. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching the door. I held my breath, hoping that whoever was coming would understand I needed help. The footsteps slowed, then stopped just outside the door. I heard a muffled voice, but I couldn't make out what it said. I repeated my plea, "Please, help me. I'm trapped in here." The footsteps receded, and then there was silence again. I pressed my ear to the door once more and heard nothing. I ran my hand along the edge of the door, feeling for any weakness, any latch I could break. I realized with a sinking feeling that I might be stuck here for a long time. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was my friend, telling me that he was about 5 minutes away and that he had alerted the park ranger as well. I tried to focus on that, repeating to myself that help was coming. I looked around the room again, my eyes scanning every corner for something to use. I found a heavy metal trash can sitting in a corner and dragged it over to the door. I wedged it under the handle and pulled with all my might. The door gave a little, then nothing more. I nearly broke down. I kept yelling, "Help! Somebody, please help me." My voice echoed in the small room, and I wondered if anyone outside even heard me. I was shaking so badly that I couldn't keep my grip on the trash can for long. Finally, after what seemed like an hour, I heard the sound of a car door opening and the distant murmur of voices. The door's lock click echoed through the room. I heard a key turn in the lock from the outside. I rushed to the door and, with one final shove, it swung open. There, standing in the doorway, was a park ranger and my friend, both with worried faces. I practically collapsed into their arms, tears streaming down my face. The ranger apologized, saying that someone had been spotted hanging around the building. He had come to check on the restroom and, seeing no one inside, locked the door as a precaution to prevent vandalism. He had no idea that I was still inside. My friend, who had driven up as soon as he got my text, said he was terrified when he saw my text and was relieved I was safe. I couldn't speak for a long time afterward. I just sat there, leaning against the door, still in shock. The park ranger took some information, and my friend called a tow truck for my car. I was eventually driven home, still trembling from the encounter. That night, in the safety of my own bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I replayed every moment in my mind, the sound of the lock clicking behind me, the distant footsteps, my own screams echoing in that tiny room. I've heard people say that sometimes fear makes you see things, but I know what I heard, what I felt. I was alone in a park restroom when someone, or something, locked me in. I'm safe now, but I haven't been back to that park since. I still wonder who locked the door and why they let me live through it without a harm. I suppose I'm just grateful I got out alive. Every time I pass a small, remote building now, I can't help but remember that night, the sound of the lock, the silence, and my desperate calls for help echoing in the darkness. I've been hiking for years, and I know these woods like the back of my hand. I often take long solo trips to clear my head. One weekend last fall, I decided to go off the beaten path in a remote area I had never been to before. I packed my usual gear, a small backpack with some food, water, and extra clothes, and set out early in the morning. The weather was cool, and the trail was quiet, with only the sound of my boots on the dirt and the rustle of leaves in the wind. About 3 hours into my hike, I took a detour from the main trail and found myself in a small clearing. In the middle of it was a tent, fully set up, as if someone had just been camping there. I walked closer, puzzled, because I hadn't seen any signs of other hikers or any roads nearby. The tent was a standard two-person one, set neatly with a tarp, and it looked almost too new. There was a sleeping bag folded neatly inside, some extra clothes hanging on a line, a small pile of food containers, and a few items of camping gear like a flashlight and a folded map. Everything was there, left exactly as if the owner had just stepped away for a minute. I circled the tent a few times and looked around. There was no sign of a person anywhere, no footprints leading away or any abandoned campfire. I even looked inside the tent, and it was empty. I thought for a moment that maybe the person had gone for a walk or to use the restroom, but the clearing was so remote that I doubted anyone would be around. The tent and its contents looked untouched, as if the owner had simply vanished. I felt a chill run through me, not because I was cold, but because something about the scene felt wrong. I left the clearing and continued on my hike, trying to push the odd feeling to the back of my mind. I kept thinking about that tent and wondering who could have left it there. I made sure not to disturb anything, and I kept a mental note of the clearing's location so I could check it later. That night, I camped on a ridge a few miles away. I barely slept, my mind kept drifting back to the tent. I imagined someone watching me from the trees or hiding behind that setup, waiting for me to come back. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the uneasiness lingered. In the morning, I decided I had to go back. I wanted to see if anything had changed. I retraced my steps and soon arrived back at the clearing. The first sight of the tent made my heart race again, but this time I was more cautious. I walked slowly around the perimeter, checking every angle, half expecting to see a person hiding behind a bush. There was no one. I stepped closer to the tent and peered inside. Everything was gone. The sleeping bag, the extra clothes, all the camping gear and food had vanished. The tent itself was still there, neatly set up as before, but inside it was empty. I even looked at the ground around the tent and saw faint marks where the items might have been dumped, but they were gone now. I couldn't understand it. How could someone take everything so quickly without leaving any sign of themselves? My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe someone had been watching the area and decided to take the belongings. I thought about the remote location and how unlikely it was for a casual hiker to pass by unnoticed. The idea that someone had planned this and might have been nearby made my skin crawl. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty tent and feeling more and more uneasy. I took out my phone and snapped a few pictures, even though I wasn't sure who I would call. I didn't want to be wrong about something like this, but I felt I had to do something. I left the clearing as quickly as I could, retracing my steps back to the main trail. The hike back was silent, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Later that day, I stopped at a small ranger station on the edge of the park. I told the officer what had happened to the strange tent I had found, how it was fully set up, and how on my return the next morning everything was gone. The officer listened carefully, taking notes. He said that sometimes people leave abandoned campsites in the woods, but he had never heard of one being robbed like that. He promised to check the area and look into any reports, but I could see he was as puzzled as I was. That night I drove back home, still unsettled by the whole experience. I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering if I had missed any clues. I was safe in my car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there watching me, that something sinister had taken place in that clearing. I couldn't prove anything, and there were no witnesses, but I knew what I had seen. I didn't know who would do something like this or why, but it changed the way I looked at the woods. Weeks later, I read in a local forum that a couple had reported a strange incident in a remote part of the park. They mentioned a set-up campsite that was later found empty, with all items missing. I contacted the officer who had taken my report, but he said that they had not found any new evidence or suspects. It seemed that the incident was never fully explained, and the trail was now marked as an area to be cautious in. I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. I don't know if the person who took those things was dangerous or if it was just some twisted form of theft, but I learned to trust my instincts that day. I still go hiking, but I stick to the well-trodden paths and avoid the remote areas. I sometimes wonder if I caught a glimpse of someone watching me that day, planning something all along. I will never forget the empty tent and the chill I felt when I saw that everything had been taken. I'm safe now. I live in a small apartment in town and drive every time I leave. I don't talk about it much, but sometimes I scroll through my pictures and see that tent, still set up in the middle of the woods, and I shiver. I know what I experienced was real, and I know that in those woods, someone was out there with a plan. I'll never go back to that clearing again, and I hope I never have to face something like that again. I was excited for some peace and quiet. I drove to a spot deep in the forest far away from any roads or people. I set up my small tent near a clearing and built a little fire. The day was warm, and as the sun went down, the forest was filled with the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. I was glad to be alone for once. After eating dinner and watching the sunset, I settled into my tent. I turned off the lamp and tried to sleep to the sounds of nature. It was about midnight when I was first awakened by something unusual, a faint beam of light flickering through the trees. I couldn't tell if it was just my eyes playing tricks on me or if someone had a flashlight out there. I lay still, listening, and after a few minutes the light faded away. I went back to sleep, telling myself it was nothing. I woke again early in the morning feeling groggy, but I noticed something odd. I stepped outside the tent for a bit, and sure enough, there was a dim light moving slowly through the woods. I couldn't see the person holding it, just a small beam cutting through the darkness. It was far off, and I thought maybe someone else was camping nearby. I walked a few steps to check, but the light was gone. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was a hiker passing by. I spent the day exploring the area, taking short walks on nearby trails. I felt safe, thinking I was so far away from any civilization. When I returned to camp in the late afternoon, I set up my small campfire and relaxed. As dusk fell, I started to feel uneasy again. I had that nagging thought from the night before, and I couldn't shake it. At about 9 p.m., I sat by my fire, listening to the night sounds, when I caught a glimpse of something at the edge of the trees, a small, moving light. It was the same kind of faint flashlight beam I'd seen earlier. This time, it seemed a bit closer than before, but still far enough that I couldn't tell who might be holding it. My heart started to beat a little faster as I watched it slowly drift along a path that led deeper into the woods, not directly toward my camp but steadily getting closer in each passing hour. I kept an eye on it from the safety of my camp, trying not to jump to conclusions. Every time I looked, the light was further along the same trail, always at a distance that made it seem like it was following me, yet never coming straight to my tent. I debated whether to pack up and leave, but the trail was dark and I wasn't sure where it would lead. I felt torn between staying safe and wanting to know who or what was out there. I decided to stay put for a while, thinking that by morning I would have a better idea of what was happening. I kept the fire burning, my eyes occasionally drifting to the dark line of trees where the beam had been. The minutes ticked by slowly, and I kept noticing that the light would appear for a few seconds, then vanish. It seemed like the person was watching, pacing around my camp, but never coming directly at me. I couldn't tell if it was deliberate or if they were just curious, but each time the light drew closer, I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. Around 2 a.m., the beam was almost at the edge of my clearing. I lay awake, barely breathing, staring at the darkness outside my tent. The light never came closer than a few dozen feet away, yet it was obvious it was moving in a pattern that meant it was watching me. I could hear my own heart pounding so loud in my ears that I couldn't think straight. I kept thinking, if it gets any closer, I'm done for. I stayed in that state for what felt like an eternity. Every now and then, the beam would flicker, then retreat back into the trees. I wondered if I should call out or even try to get a better look, but I was too scared to move. I couldn't tell if the person was alone or if there was more than one following me. I decided it was best not to disturb whoever it was. When the first hints of dawn appeared, the light was still out there, but not moving as quickly as before. I finally mustered the courage to step out of my tent and look around. The beam was gone, and the forest was quiet again. I spent a few minutes checking the area with a small flashlight, but found no trace of anyone. There were no footprints, no disturbed bushes, nothing that indicated someone had been there in the morning. I packed up my gear that day and left the camp, still feeling unsettled. I told myself that maybe it was just some prank or a lost hiker trying to find shelter, but deep down, I knew something was off. I later learned that there had been reports of a local man known for wandering the woods at night, often with a flashlight, but I never got any confirmation if it was him or not. I reached civilization safely, and I haven't gone camping alone since that night. I reported the incident to the park authorities, and they promised to check the area, but nothing ever came of it. Even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of that faint beam moving through the woods, always just out of reach, always following me. I'm safe now, but every time I see a flashlight beam in the distance, I remember that night and the feeling of being watched deep in the dark woods. I was out hiking alone on a cool autumn day, trying to clear my head and enjoy some time away from everything. I had chosen a trail I'd never done before, a narrow, winding path through a patch of forest that was mostly untouched. The leaves were turning orange and red, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. I wasn't in a rush. I just needed a few hours to think and let nature do its work. About 2 hours into the hike, when I was deep in the woods and the trail was quiet except for the crunch of leaves under my boots, I saw something odd. There, on the trunk of a large oak tree by the side of the trail, was a hand-drawn map pinned with a knife. I stopped and stared at it, my heart suddenly picking up pace. The map was crudely drawn in dark ink on a piece of paper that looked old and a bit torn around the edges. It showed the very trail I was on. Every bend and fork was marked out, but then I noticed something else. There were markings that led off the trail into an area of the woods that I hadn't seen before. At first, I thought it might be a prank by another hiker, or maybe someone had lost something and left it behind. But the knife was real, rusted but sharp, with a handle that looked worn from use. The map was pinned to the tree with it, as if someone wanted it to be found. I pulled it off the tree carefully. My hands trembled as I held it up and studied it closely. The markings were detailed, little arrows and notes scribbled along the path. One section had a drawing of a small clearing and a line leading off the main trail toward what looked like a cluster of trees. I felt a prickling in the back of my neck. I had seen no one around, but something about the map made me uneasy. Who would go to the trouble of making such a map and leaving it here? And why would it show a detour away from the safe path? I sat down on a nearby log, opened the map, and tried to figure out what it meant. My mind raced with thoughts. Was it meant to be a warning? A lure? I couldn't decide. The markings were messy, almost desperate, like someone had been running out of time. I looked around. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no voices, no other hikers visible on the narrow trail. I was alone, but suddenly I didn't feel safe. I pocketed the map and decided to stick to the trail. I told myself I wouldn't follow those extra markings. I had enough to worry about from the odd map alone. I continued on, but my eyes kept darting to the tree where I'd found it. My thoughts kept returning to the possibility that someone might be watching me. I tried to shake off the unease and focus on the beauty of the woods, but the feeling of being observed was persistent. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the trees. I didn't see anyone, but my imagination wouldn't let me rest. An hour later, as I neared a fork in the trail, I stopped for a water break. I sat on a rock and pulled out my water bottle, still thinking about the map. I unfolded it again, and that's when I saw it, a small, hastily drawn arrow circling the fork, pointing off the trail toward a dense stand of trees. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a rush. My stomach churned. I didn't have a logical reason to follow it, but a part of me wondered if I should. Then I remembered the map was left behind by someone. I wasn't sure if I was meant to see it or if it was a trap. As I sat there, I heard a soft rustle in the bushes behind me. I froze. My heart pounded. I listened. The sound was low, like someone moving slowly, not running. I sat very still, barely breathing. After a few long seconds, nothing else happened. I tried to convince myself it was just a small animal, but a tiny voice in my head said otherwise. I decided to pack up and leave the area. I didn't want to risk staying any longer, not with that map still in my pocket and that creeping feeling of being watched. I resumed my hike, sticking to the main trail and keeping my eyes open. Every so often, I would glance at the map in my pocket and feel the same mix of curiosity and dread. I reached the end of the trail as the sun began to lower. I was relieved to see signs of civilization ahead, a distant road, the outline of a small town. I nearly let out a sigh of relief when I stepped off the trail. Then, as I walked along the road, I noticed something in the grass. Fresh footprints, not my own. They were small, almost childlike, but definitely human. They led from the edge of the forest toward the road and then stopped abruptly. I couldn't tell if they were connected to the map or to something else, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I walked quickly to a nearby gas station and called a friend to pick me up. I didn't mention the map or the footprints, but my voice trembled when I told him I needed a ride. He said he'd be there in 15 minutes. I stayed in the car, trying to calm down, looking at the empty road. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been followed, that someone was out there with malicious intent. After I got home, I left the map on my kitchen table and went straight to bed, unable to sleep. I kept thinking about the arrow on that map and the footprints that had suddenly appeared. I searched online later for any stories or reports of missing hikers or mysterious markings on trails in that area, but found nothing that matched. It was as if I had uncovered a secret meant only for me, a message left by someone who was watching. I told a few friends about the incident, but they thought I was overreacting. I wasn't sure if I was just seeing things because I was alone in the woods or if there was really someone out there leaving maps and footprints. I couldn't prove it, and I couldn't let it go. Every time I went for a walk near that area, I remembered the map, the arrow pointing off the trail, and the footprints that led nowhere. I felt a deep sense of violation, like someone had deliberately set up the trap and was watching to see if I'd take the bait. A few weeks later, I decided to visit the trail again, with a friend this time. I wanted to see if there was any sign of that map or any more footprints. My friend and I drove to the trailhead and hiked a short distance before we turned back. There was nothing. No maps, no footprints. The woods were silent and ordinary again. I never did find out who had left that map or why. I reported it to the local park service, but they said there had been no other reports of strange activity. I kept the map, though. I still have it on my shelf, tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of that day. Sometimes I take it out and stare at it, trying to piece together its meaning. I wonder if it was meant as a warning or a lure, if I was supposed to follow those off-trail markings and see where they led. I never did follow the arrow. I've learned my lesson. I don't take shortcuts in the woods anymore, and I always keep an eye out for things that don't belong. I'm safe now, back in the city, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think of that map and the footprints and feel that chill all over again. I don't know if I'll ever get over what I saw that day, but I know one thing, I will never be the same. I'd been out camping for 2 nights in a remote area up in the mountains. I'd always gone alone for a change of pace and quiet time, so when I decided on this trip, I thought nothing bad could happen. I set up my small, rugged tent near a clearing with a view of the valley below. I locked my tent properly that night, double-checking the zipper and the drawstring, and went to sleep early, feeling safe and alone under the stars. I woke up in the dark, cold and shivering, to the sound of crickets and my own slow breathing. I reached for my phone on my nightstand, ready to check the time and maybe set my alarm for an early start. But my hand met empty air. My phone was gone. I scrambled around the tent in a panic, searching every pocket and corner of my sleeping bag. The door was zipped up tight, and I was sure I had left my phone right there on the little table inside my tent before I slept. My heart started pounding. I checked again, this time with shaking hands. It was nowhere to be found. I sat there in silence for a moment, trying to figure out what could have happened. I thought maybe I had mislaid it outside, but my tent had been locked. I remembered putting it there after dinner, and then closing up for the night. There was no way anyone could have gotten in, at least not without leaving a mark. I looked around, half expecting to see someone peeking through the zipper, but there was nothing. After a few agonizing minutes, I decided to hike back to the ranger station. The trail was still dark, and I was scared, but I had no other choice. I grabbed my flashlight and a jacket, then left my tent, locking it as best as I could. I started the hike down the trail, my boots crunching on gravel, the only sound in the cold night. I kept thinking about the phone, and how important it was to me for maps and calls if I got lost. My mind kept racing. Was someone watching me? Had a thief been in my tent while I slept? The hike was long and lonely, the dark trees looming over me like silent sentinels. I moved quickly, my flashlight beam bouncing off the trunks as I hurried along the narrow trail toward the ranger station I remembered being a few miles away. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I felt as if I saw a shadow that wasn't mine, but I told myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the ranger station. It was a small, unassuming building with a single porch. I was relieved to see a light on inside the station. I walked up to the porch, my heart still beating fast from the trek. I knocked on the door, and after a few seconds, a guard opened it. His face was kind but tired from a long shift. "Can I help you?" he asked. I swallowed hard. My phone, it was in my tent, but now it's gone. I think someone took it. I need to check if it might be here. He frowned. "In your tent? Are you sure you locked it?" "Positive," I said, voice trembling. I remember leaving it on my table inside, and I zipped everything up. I don't know how someone could have gotten in. The guard looked around, then said, "Well, come on in. We haven't had any reports of theft around here, but let's see if we can find it." He stepped aside, and I walked inside the small building. The station was dimly lit, with only a couple of desks and a map of the park pinned on the wall. I explained my situation quickly, and he nodded slowly. "I'll call it in," he said, typing something into his computer. "In the meantime, why don't you wait here? I'll be right back." I sat down in one of the chairs, my thoughts racing. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone to be waiting there. After a few minutes, I heard a soft knock on the door and then footsteps coming toward the porch. The guard came back with a puzzled look on his face. He motioned for me to follow him out onto the porch. My stomach churned as I stepped outside into the early morning light. There, sitting on the wooden steps of the station's porch, was my phone. It lay on the ground, unlocked, the screen lit up, showing a gallery of photos. I didn't know what to think. I picked it up slowly, trying to keep my hands steady. The phone had obviously been on for a while. I tapped the screen, and the photo gallery opened. My heart nearly stopped when I saw what was inside. There were several photos, taken during the night. I scrolled through them with growing horror. The first few photos were blurry, but then one became clear, an image of my tent, taken from outside, in the dark. I recognized the spot where I had left my sleeping bag and table. Another photo showed the inside of my tent, taken from an angle I knew I couldn't have achieved from the inside. The timestamps were all from the middle of the night, the exact time I'd been asleep. The last photo was the worst. It showed a shadowy figure standing just outside the tent's opening, half in the darkness. The face was obscured, and I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but it was there, staring in. I looked up at the guard, voice barely a whisper. "Did you see this?" He glanced at the phone and frowned. "No, I haven't." "Where did this come from?" I shook my head. "I don't know." My phone was in my tent, then it was gone, and now it's here with these photos taken during the night. The guard's eyes widened as he took a closer look. "I'm going to call it in," he said, dialing his radio. After a few tense moments, he came back. "We're going to check the area," he said. "Stay here." They sent a couple of officers out with flashlights to search the grounds, especially around where my tent had been set up. I stayed on the porch, holding the phone tightly. I kept replaying the photos in my head, the feeling of being watched filling me with dread. About 20 minutes later, one officer came back, shaking his head. "There's no sign of anyone," he said. "No footprints, no extra gear, nothing." The guard looked at me with concern. "We're going to check your campsite, too, just to be sure." I nodded silently. I followed them out to where my tent had been. When we reached the spot, everything looked untouched except for my tent, which was still there, undisturbed. There were no footprints in the dirt around it, no signs that someone had set up camp or lingered. It was as if my phone had just teleported from my tent to the ranger station porch. I couldn't understand it. My phone was taken, then returned, but with photos that I never took. Who had done this? And how had they gotten inside my tent if it had been locked? Later that day, I went home and tried to put the whole thing behind me. I still couldn't sleep that night, though, the images from my phone replaying in my mind over and over. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a sick prank maybe, or someone messing with the security cameras. But nothing in the park had any cameras. I reported the incident to the park authorities and gave them my phone and the photos. They promised to investigate further, but as the days passed, I never heard anything more about it. I haven't gone camping since that trip, and I still try not to think about what might have happened. Even now, months later, I remember the feeling of waking up in my tent and finding my phone missing, the terror of not knowing who had been watching me in the dark. I'm safe now, living in the city, far away from those silent, watchful woods, but sometimes, late at night, when I see a phone light up unexpectedly, I can't help but shudder. I still have the photos. They sit in a folder on my computer, a reminder of a night I'll never forget, and a mystery that was never fully solved. I went on a solo hiking trip last fall, trying to clear my head after a rough few months. I picked a well-known trail in a state forest where I usually felt safe. The day was cool and crisp, and the path was lined with trees and fallen leaves. I set out early in the morning, planning to do a long loop and camp overnight near a small clearing. I had my backpack, some water, a sandwich, and a map. Nothing more than that. I spent the day enjoying the hike. The trail was quiet, and I liked the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt. I took a few pictures with my phone when the light was good, and I even stopped a couple of times to rest by a stream. As the afternoon wore on, I felt calm and content, like nothing could go wrong on a day like this. That evening, as I made my way back to the small clearing where I planned to camp, the light began to fade. I decided to set up my tent near a stand of trees so I could have some cover. After a while, I built a small fire and sat down to eat my sandwich and sip some water. The silence of the woods was deep, broken only by the occasional sound of a twig snapping under the weight of a deer or the rustle of leaves in the wind. After I finished eating, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. I thought about how peaceful it was to be alone in nature, away from all the noise of everyday life. I closed the zipper, turned off my small lantern, and drifted off to sleep. I woke sometime after midnight, in a darkness so complete that I could hardly tell where the tent ended and the night began. I lay still for a long time, trying to get back to sleep. Then, I heard it, a soft sound that I almost thought was my own breathing. It was faint, like a whisper, but it was not the usual wind or the rustling of the trees outside. It sounded like someone was saying my name. I sat up in the dark, heart pounding, straining my ears. It was so quiet around me except for that sound. I couldn't be sure, but I distinctly heard Emily, my name. I froze, not daring to move or speak. I listened again. There was a moment of silence, and then the whisper came again, softer this time, as if coming from somewhere off the trail. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination mixed with the wind and my fear, but the sound was too clear. It was as if someone had learned to mimic my voice. I pulled the flap of my tent open a crack, peeking out into the dim light. I saw nothing but darkness and the faint outline of trees. I called out softly, "Hello," hoping for an answer. There was no reply. The whispering stopped instantly, as if whoever had been there had vanished. I sat there in the tent, wide awake, heart thumping. I kept the tent flap open, but I could see no one around. The silence after that was deafening. I waited for a while, too scared to sleep, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell into a restless, fitful sleep, plagued by the sound of that whispered name echoing in my mind. When I woke up the next morning, the first light of dawn crept through the trees. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, feeling the cool morning air wash over me. I looked around, trying to see if there was any sign of someone nearby. The campsite was empty. No tracks, no disturbance in the leaves, nothing that would point to a person spending the night here. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling from the night before. I had been alone for years on these trails, and nothing like this had ever happened. I decided to pack up and head back to the trailhead, thinking that maybe I had been overreacting. As I walked, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone lurking behind a tree or hiding in the shadows, but I saw no one. However, as I reached a fork in the trail a short distance from my campsite, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the soft mud next to the path, small, light footprints that did not match my size or the size of any animal I could think of. They were arranged in a loose line and led off the main trail into the woods. I knelt down to examine them, and I could tell they were human footprints, fresh and deliberate. I remembered the whisper. I shivered and felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. I thought about what had happened last night. Someone had whispered my name and then disappeared. Now, there were footprints showing that someone had been off the trail, maybe watching me, maybe coming close. I felt my stomach twist with dread. I hurried back to the campsite, glancing around nervously. I decided not to follow the footprints. I needed to get to safety. I gathered my gear quickly and started hiking back along the main trail, every step feeling heavier with fear. I didn't see anyone on my way out, but I kept thinking about that voice in the dark and the footprints that led nowhere. I finally reached a small ranger station near the trailhead. I went inside and told the ranger what had happened. He listened, his face serious. He said he had had a few reports of strange sounds in the woods recently, but nothing concrete. He took my statement and promised to send someone to check the area. After that, I got a ride back to my car and drove home. I couldn't shake the memory of the whisper and the footprints. I called a friend and told her the story, and she said she'd never heard of anything like it. I kept thinking that someone had been following me, that someone had been waiting in the dark just to whisper my name. But no one was ever found, and the ranger said the area looked undisturbed that morning. I've not gone back to that trail since then. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the whisper was just the wind and my own fear playing tricks on me. But I still remember the cold tone of that whisper and the sudden silence that followed when I called out. I still see the footprints in my mind, small and delicate, leading off into the dark woods and then disappearing without a trace. I live in the city now, and I don't hike alone anymore. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I still hear my name softly spoken in the dark, and I wonder if someone out there is still watching, still waiting for me to return to that lonely trail. I am safe now, but I will never forget the terror of that night, the moment when I realized I was now alone in the woods, even when I thought I was. I've been hiking these woods for years, so I thought I knew every twist and turn of the trails. That day, I decided to take a shortcut off the beaten path to clear my head. I left my usual trail and headed deep into the forest, where the trees were thick and the light barely made it through the canopy. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and the air felt heavy with moisture. I'd been walking for a couple of hours when I suddenly saw something that didn't belong. There, nestled among the ferns and hidden by branches, was a small tent. It wasn't on the trail at all. It was camouflaged so well that it almost looked like a part of the forest floor. The tent was drab, covered in leaves and dirt, and it looked like someone had purposely set it up to blend in. I stopped dead in my tracks and stared at it. I hadn't seen any other hikers nearby, and the area was remote enough that I doubted anyone would have set up a camp there for fun. My heart started pounding, and I pulled out my phone to take a picture. My hand shook a bit as I snapped a few photos from different angles. I wanted to capture every detail, the way the fabric of the tent merged with the colors of the forest, the faint glint of metal on a zipper, even the soft imprint of a footprint in the mud by its side. I looked around and saw no one, and I quickly convinced myself that I must have been the only one there. I decided to mark the location on my map and then headed back to the trail. The rest of the hike was uneasy. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling that someone might be watching me. I tried to shake the feeling off by thinking that maybe it was just a prank or some kind of art project. But deep down, I wasn't sure. The image of that hidden tent wouldn't leave my mind. When I got back to the trailhead, I waited until the next morning to process what I'd seen. I drove into town and went straight to the ranger station. I explained what had happened, showing them the photos I had taken. The ranger, a middle-aged guy named Dave, listened carefully. He said that this part of the forest was known for being isolated, but he hadn't heard of anyone setting up a hidden camp like that. He took the photos, examined them on his computer, and then told me he'd send a team out to check the area. I felt a mix of relief and lingering dread as I drove back to the spot. I couldn't help but replay the night in my head, the eerie silence, the dense trees, and that odd tent blending into the surroundings. I arrived back at the location just after noon, when the forest was bright and the oppressive darkness of the previous night was gone. I parked my car a safe distance away and joined a small group of rangers who had come out to search the area. We walked back down the trail toward where I had found the tent. I pointed out the exact spot and showed them my pictures. The rangers split into two groups, searching carefully around the area. I watched as they combed through the underbrush, looked behind fallen logs, and even lifted some branches. Every few minutes, someone would come back shaking his head or telling the others he hadn't found anything. After what felt like an hour, Dave came back to me. His face was puzzled. "I'm sorry, but there's no sign of a tent here," he said. I stared at him, trying to catch a hint of a joke, but his expression was serious. I went over to the spot where I had taken the photos. The ground was undisturbed, aside from the natural debris. There were no remains of fabric or markings that would indicate something had been set up. It was as if the tent had never been there at all. I felt a cold pit in my stomach. I rechecked my photos on my phone. Every shot was clear. The tent was real. I remembered the weight of it in the forest, the sound of the wind through its fabric, and the detail of the hidden zipper that caught the light. I even recalled noticing a faint smell of something like damp earth mixed with metal. But now, the ranger's search turned up empty. Dave looked at me with concern. "Maybe someone took it down after you left," he suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. There are cases of illegal campers or poachers setting up hidden camps. They sometimes remove evidence if they think they're being watched. I didn't know what to think. If someone had been there, why would they want to remove the tent? What was the point? The idea that someone might have been using that hidden tent and then quickly removed it kept me up that night. I stayed in a motel near the trailhead, restless and replaying every detail of that encounter. I kept the photos on my phone, looking at them over and over, trying to see if I'd missed any clue. The image of that camouflaged tent, perfectly blended into the forest, haunted me. I reported the incident to the park authorities, and they took my account seriously enough to note it in their records. They never did find any trace of the tent or any evidence of whoever might have been there. In the end, it remained an unsolved mystery. I eventually went back to my normal life, though I never hiked that trail again. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there for a reason, that they had left that map-like image of the tent for me to find, and then vanished into the forest as if it had never existed. I've thought about that day many times since. The memory still sends shivers down my spine. I sometimes wonder if it was all a trick of my mind, but the photos are real. And the ranger's search was thorough. I'm safe now, back in the city, but I still keep my eyes open when I'm out in nature. I learned that day that not everything you find in the woods is meant to be found, and sometimes, what you stumble upon can change the way you see everything around you. I still don't know who set up that hidden tent or why they took it down, but I do know one thing: I will never forget that feeling of being watched by something or someone who left no trace behind, except for a few undeniable photos on a cold autumn day. I went out to Lake Dalton last September, first time in a while. It's about 20 miles out from town, mostly logging roads and dirt tracks. Not a place where people end up by accident. I like going out there alone. It's always dead quiet, no cell service, just trees and water. I've been fishing there since I was a kid. I got to the lake around 6 in the morning. Fog was still on the water, just starting to burn off. I carried my gear down to the little clearing by the shore. There's not much of a bank there, just rocks and patches of wet grass. I set up like always, folding chair, tackle box, cooler by my feet. The whole place was still. I could hear birds way off in the trees and the occasional splash from something out in the lake. I sat there for a couple of hours, casting and reeling in. I wasn't catching much, just a few small ones. Around 9, the sun was up enough to cut through the fog, and that's when I saw him across the lake on the far side. He was standing on this little patch of shore about 50 yards away. Just a man, dressed in dark clothes, maybe a jacket. He had a fishing rod in his hand, but he wasn't using it. Just stood there, facing the water. His face was in shadow under a cap, and I couldn't make out much detail. I figured he must have come in from one of the old service trails on that side. Not many people know about them unless they've been around a while. It struck me as odd, though. Most guys out there would give a little wave or nod if they saw someone across the lake, but he didn't. I tried not to think much of it. People come out there to be alone. Maybe he was one of those types who didn't like making small talk. I kept fishing, but every time I glanced over, he was still standing there, rod in hand, not casting. Just facing the water. By late morning, the sun was up high, and it was getting warm. I kept looking over now and then, but he never moved. Not once. His posture never changed. He wasn't checking his phone or fiddling with his gear. Just standing, watching the lake. I started to feel off. I kept telling myself he was probably just enjoying the quiet, but there was something wrong about the way he stood so still. My mind started making up little reasons. Maybe he was waiting on bait, or maybe his line was snagged. But deep down, none of that made sense. I made myself stop looking. I kept my eyes on the water and tried to focus on fishing. Every now and then, I hear branches crack or birds flap around in the woods behind me, and each time I glanced back without meaning to, but he was still there. Same spot. Same posture. By noon, I couldn't ignore it anymore. My stomach felt tight, like when you know something isn't right but can't explain why. I stood up, stretched, and made a show of digging through my cooler like I wasn't paying him any attention. When I glanced across the lake, I noticed something. There wasn't any tackle box by his feet. No cooler, no chair. Just him. I started feeling exposed out there on the bank. The woods were thick behind me, and the nearest road was about a mile hike back up the ridge. If something happened, there wouldn't be anyone around to hear it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I thought maybe if I called out, it would break whatever weird tension had settled between us. I cleared my throat, gave a little wave, and shouted, "Any luck?" He didn't answer. Didn't move. He must have heard me. Sound carries easy across the water out there. I felt my heart start beating harder, but I made myself sit back down. I kept my head low, pretending to fiddle with my reel, but I was watching him out of the corner of my eye. Another hour passed. The sun was high, beating down on the lake. I hadn't seen him cast a single time. I started thinking maybe he was just off. You get some strange folks out in places like that. Maybe he was out there to clear his head, maybe not all there. But the longer he stood like that, still as a statue, the worse it felt. Around 2, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up slow, trying not to act like I was in a hurry. My hands were shaking, though. I kept looking over, expecting him to finally break that stillness, but he never did. He just stood there with his head tipped down, rod dangling loose in his hand. I kept my knife in my pocket, thumb hooked through the loop the whole time I packed up. When I finally started back toward the trail, I didn't look at him again. I just kept my head down and walked steady. The whole way up through the woods, I kept waiting to hear footsteps behind me. Every little crack of branches made me freeze in place, holding my breath. When I finally made it back to the car, I locked the doors right away and sat there with the engine running, trying to calm down. After a few minutes, I drove up the ridge where there's a little overlook that gives a view down onto the lake. I pulled over and got out to look. He was gone. There was no boat. No trail leading out from that spot. Just empty shore. I haven't been back since. I hiked out to Elk Ridge last fall, end of October. It's a long trail about 8 miles from the parking lot to the backcountry sites. I went by myself. I've done solo trips before. I liked the quiet. The trail was empty the whole way in. No cars at the lot, no boot prints on the path. Weather was clear but cold, dipping below freezing at night. It was the last trip I planned for the season. The campsite's small, just 3 tent pads cleared out in a patch of pines near the ridge line. There's a wooden box nailed to a post near the fire ring with a logbook inside. I've seen them at a few sites before, just a little book with a pencil tied to it where people sign their names, date, maybe leave a note about trail conditions. I signed it when I got there. My name, the date, said I was staying one night. I set up my tent and got a fire going by sundown. Sat by the flames for a while, made dinner, read a little. It got dark fast under the trees. Around 9, I heard something moving out in the woods. Twigs snapping, footsteps. I listened for a while, but it stayed far off. Could have been deer or a bear. It's normal to hear things out there, especially that time of year when everything's dry and brittle. I went to bed a little after 10. Woke up once in the night to pee, then slept straight through till dawn. In the morning, I made coffee and walked down to the little stream about a quarter mile from camp to fill my bottle. When I came back, I stopped by the logbook again, just flipping through out of boredom. That's when I noticed it. 3 entries on the last page, all from the day before. My name was at the top, then 2 other names below, Adam and Jesse T. Both dated the same day. Both written in the exact same handwriting. Same slanted letters. Same little loop on the capital J. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. The names were different, but everything else was the same. I looked around the clearing like maybe I missed something, some sign that somebody else had been there. But there were only my tracks in the dirt. Fire ring was cold. No tents, no gear. I walked the whole site, checked between the trees, down by the ridge. Nothing. I told myself maybe someone was messing around. Maybe a couple of guys came through together and one of them wrote both names down. People do weird things when they're out alone. I packed up slow, trying not to let it get to me. Kept telling myself it was nothing. On the way out, I stopped by the logbook one last time. There was a new entry under mine. Sarah K. Same handwriting. Same date. I didn't write it. I didn't hear anyone in the night. I didn't see a single person the whole hike out. I don't go out alone anymore. I've been thinking about this for a while, and it's hard to get it out of my head. What happened? I guess I never really talked about it. I've read enough posts on here where people ask about strange things they've come across in the woods. Well, this was like that, but worse. It started last month, right around the time the weather began to turn a bit colder. I've always been the type to go hiking alone, and I've done it for years. Not some backcountry expert or anything, but I know how to find my way around, stay safe, and keep my head. At least, I thought I did. I was out on this trail near a small town, one that I had done before. It was a familiar place. I'd done a lot of hiking around the area, but there's always a part of me that gets a little nervous in the quieter sections of the forest. Sometimes you're walking for hours, and it feels like nobody's been there in ages. And that's exactly how it was that day. I wasn't expecting to see anyone. That's usually the best part about these hikes, being alone in the middle of nowhere. So, when I saw something odd ahead of me, it didn't make much sense. There was a van parked by the trees, not on the main trail, but off a little ways into the underbrush, like someone had tried to hide it. It was an old van, rusted, faded blue, covered in dirt and what looked like tree sap. At first, I thought it might just be abandoned, but something felt off. The closer I got, the more I noticed. There were cigarette butts all over the ground around it. Fresh ones. I know the difference. They weren't old and dried out, like they'd been sitting there for days. No, these were fresh. They were still soft from the heat, some of them half burned, the ash barely settled. It didn't make sense. Nobody came this way often, not in a van, anyway. It was a rough area to get to. I stood there for a few minutes, just looking at the van. There wasn't any sign of anyone around. No car parked nearby, no trails leading off in any direction. But I could tell from the way the cigarettes were scattered that someone had been here. I kept my distance, just observing. But then I started thinking maybe someone was inside the van. Maybe they were just resting, taking a break. I wasn't sure if I should approach, but I couldn't ignore the feeling. Something wasn't right. I walked around the van slowly, trying to get a better look, but it was all covered in grime. The windows were too dirty to see through, and the van itself was silent. I don't know why, but I knocked on the door, lightly. I don't even know why I did it. It was stupid. No answer. Then, just when I was about to turn around, I heard a sound. A creak from inside the van. I froze. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was enough to make my heart jump into my throat. Someone was definitely in there. I told myself it was probably just someone resting, but the feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. You know that feeling when something's wrong, when everything in your body is telling you to get out of there? I backed up a few steps, my eyes still locked on the van. The sound came again, this time louder. It was the kind of noise you make when you shift your weight, like the floor of the van was creaking under someone moving around. I couldn't tell what they were doing, but it didn't feel right. My first instinct was to turn around and walk away. I've been in situations before where I knew better than to push my luck. But instead, I stood there for a minute, trying to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe they didn't even know I was there. I could just keep walking. But before I could make up my mind, the side door of the van slid open, just a crack. I saw a hand, pale and trembling, gripping the edge of the door. It was just for a moment. Enough time to make me freeze. I don't know how to explain it, but that moment changed everything. Something in the way the hand appeared, the way it gripped the door, it felt wrong. It didn't feel like a normal person trying to get out or say hello. It felt like someone who was too scared to move, or maybe too injured to do anything. The hand didn't seem to belong to anyone normal. I should have run. But instead, I called out. I don't know why I did it. I must have been hoping for a normal answer, a voice asking for help or saying, "Hey, I'm just resting." But no voice came. The hand pulled back and the door slammed shut. Not just closed, but slammed. My heart started pounding harder. I was in a situation now, wasn't I? It wasn't just a person relaxing in a van. Whoever or whatever was in there didn't want to be seen. And they definitely didn't want anyone getting any closer. I took a step back, trying to move quietly. But as I turned to leave, I heard something else. Footsteps. Soft but fast, coming from behind the van. It was like someone had moved from one side to the other, trying to get a better angle at me without me seeing them. I was suddenly acutely aware of how isolated I was. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That wasn't just some camper. This wasn't just someone passing through. My instinct kicked in, and I started moving faster, my legs carrying me quickly toward the trail. But the footsteps followed. They were light, but they were there. Whoever was behind that van was moving quickly. I could hear their breathing, shallow and fast, almost like they were scared or excited. It sounded too much like someone who had been waiting for something. I picked up my pace, not wanting to look behind me. My mind raced. I couldn't make sense of it. I should have been further down the trail, where there were other people, but this was the part of the forest where nobody came, and now I was trapped with whatever was following me. Finally, when I thought I might pass out from the panic, I saw a figure up ahead. It was a person. I couldn't tell who they were, but they were standing right on the trail, blocking the way. My heart stopped. Whoever it was, they were waiting. They weren't moving. It was just standing there, silent. I had no choice. I was running now. I sprinted forward, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't think I'd make it, but I had to get out of there. When I reached the figure, it didn't even move. I pushed past it, nearly knocking it over. It was a man, tall, dressed in old clothes, his face pale and sickly. He didn't say anything, just stared at me as I ran past. His eyes were wide, vacant. I don't know how I got back to the main trail. Everything blurred after that. I didn't look back. I just ran, and when I finally made it to a more populated area, I didn't stop. I didn't slow down until I reached the road, where I saw a car. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel safe. I don't know what happened back there, and I don't ever want to go back. We decided to take a weekend trip out to the woods, just a small group of us. It wasn't anything special. Just a few friends, a couple of tents, and a weekend in nature. We weren't out there for anything more than to relax, get some fresh air, and drink a few beers by the campfire. We'd gotten there in the late afternoon, the sun starting to dip toward the horizon. The spot was perfect, tucked away in a quiet area of the woods, far enough from any kind of road that you wouldn't hear any traffic. No one else was around. We set up our tents and made the usual jokes about who would be sleeping the furthest from the fire. Everything was light, everything was fun. Then we saw him. It was just after sunset. The light had that kind of orange glow that stretches out just before it completely fades. One of us, Eli, I think, pointed it out first. There was a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the clearing. He was tall, a silhouette against the fading light, just standing there. At first, I thought it was just someone else camping nearby, maybe someone who'd taken a walk and stopped to look at the view. But when Eli called out to him, he didn't respond. "Hey! You okay over there?" Eli shouted, but the man didn't move. We all stared at him, confused and a bit uncomfortable. I figured he hadn't heard Eli, or maybe didn't want to talk. Maybe he was just lost in his thoughts, standing there like people do when they're looking out at something far away. But then, another minute passed, and the man didn't move. Not an inch. Is he even breathing?" someone said. That was Marcus. He had a way of speaking in these quiet, serious tones that always made things feel heavier. We all looked harder. It was difficult to make out any details from where we were, but he didn't seem to be doing anything at all. It was like he was frozen in place. "Maybe he's just doing his own thing," I said. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. After all, people do weird things when they're alone in nature, right? Maybe he was just a strange guy, standing in the woods, not really paying attention to us. But then something started to feel off. I couldn't place it, but the air around us felt different. Tighter. Maybe it was just the quiet, or the way the sky had gone from orange to nearly dark. "We should probably just go back to the tents," I suggested, trying to lighten the mood. But no one was laughing now. Everyone was just staring at the man. It didn't make any sense. I mean, what kind of person just stands there like that, especially as it gets darker and colder? "We should try again," Eli said, his voice a little louder. "Hey," he yelled, "are you all right over there?" Still, no response. No movement. We all agreed to head back to our tents, a little more on edge than we'd been before. But as we turned to walk back, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. I don't know why I did it, but I had to. And when I did, the man was still there, standing motionless at the tree line, just beyond the reach of our campfire light. That was the last time we saw him that night. We huddled around the fire, trying to ignore the strange feeling in the air, but none of us could shake it. The kind of weird feeling that keeps you looking over your shoulder, even when you don't hear anything. We didn't talk about it, though. We didn't want to make it worse. Instead, we made jokes, tried to get comfortable, and then, eventually, went to bed. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It must have been really early, just before dawn, because the sky was still dark outside. But when I opened my eyes, I felt something was wrong. Something had changed, and the sense of unease that I'd ignored earlier had settled deep into my stomach. I lay there in the dark, trying to figure out why it felt off. Then I heard a soft rustling outside the tent. I froze. It wasn't wind. It wasn't animals. It was something else. Someone walking. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moved just outside the tent. Then, just as I was about to whisper to the others, a soft knock. It was quiet at first, but unmistakable. Like someone tapping on the fabric of the tent, just enough for us to hear it from the inside. I stayed still. I couldn't even move. Then, I heard it again, closer this time, as if the person had stepped right up to the edge of our tent. I wasn't sure how long it had been since I'd heard that first knock. It felt like forever. I waited, holding my breath, praying I wouldn't make a sound. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. The footsteps started moving again. But this time, they weren't just walking by. They were coming closer. The sound stopped at the tent next to mine, and for a moment, everything was completely still. And then, I heard something else. A voice. Not loud, just a whisper, but it was enough for me to recognize it. I know you're in there. My heart dropped. I thought I might throw up. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I couldn't even move. The voice didn't sound angry, but it wasn't friendly either. It was cold, like a knife cutting through the air. I couldn't tell if it was just one person or if there were more. The voice just lingered in the air, quiet, waiting. I could hear the others stirring now, their muffled voices in the dark. I don't think anyone slept after that. The hours seemed to drag on. It felt like the night would never end, and with every passing second, the tension grew tighter. None of us dared to leave the safety of the tents. We just lay there, listening to the quiet crackle of the fire outside, too afraid to move. Finally, just as the first light of morning began to break through, I heard footsteps again. But this time, they weren't stopping. The man, whoever he was walking away. The sound faded as he disappeared into the trees. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. The moment the sun came up, we packed everything we could grab and got out of there. We didn't talk about it much on the way back. I think we were all too scared to. The silence in the car felt safer than trying to make sense of what happened. I don't know what that man was doing out there. I don't know why he was just standing there, and I don't know what he wanted. But I do know one thing for sure, he was not just some random person lost in the woods. Whatever it was that made my blood freeze that night, I'll never forget it. We never went back to that spot. We never even talked about it much after that day. But none of us were the same after that trip. It's hard to explain what happened. I know I'm probably just overthinking things, but there's no denying what I saw or what happened that night. I've been trying to convince myself ever since that it was just a series of strange coincidences, but deep down, I know it wasn't. I went on this hike by myself, something I've done plenty of times before. Nothing special, just a weekend in the woods to clear my head. I've always liked the solitude. There's something about being out there in the wilderness, away from everything, that calms me down. It's peaceful. It's quiet. I found a good spot for camp just as the sun started to dip behind the trees, and set up my tent. The sky was still light, but I could tell it wasn't going to be long before it would get dark. The kind of dark where you can't see anything past a few feet in front of you. I've spent enough time in the woods to know that as soon as the sun starts going down, you need to get everything ready. The last thing you want is to be stuck out there in the dark without firewood. So I grabbed my axe and headed into the woods to find someone before it got too dark. I wasn't far from camp, just off the trail, but far enough that I couldn't hear the sound of my own voice if I spoke. The wind had started to pick up, and I could hear the trees swaying around me. The smell of pine and earth was strong. I chopped a bit of wood, enough to last me for a good few hours by the fire, and made my way back to camp. The sun was almost gone now, and the shadows between the trees seemed to stretch on forever. I wasn't worried about getting lost. I knew the area well enough, but the deeper I went, the more the feeling of being watched crept over me. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was just the isolation. When I got back to camp, though, everything was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the woodpile. It was gone. All of it. The pile I just stacked near the fire pit had vanished. And I don't mean some of it was missing. It was gone. Completely. Like someone had taken it. I froze, standing there for a second, trying to process it. Maybe I had just stacked it somewhere else by mistake. Maybe I'd walked off in the wrong direction and brought back wood to the wrong place. No, that wasn't it. I was sure I had left it right there by the fire pit. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing behind a tree or lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the camp, the empty fire pit, and the trees surrounding me. I figured I must have just been seeing things. Maybe I'd forgotten where I put it, or maybe a wild animal had knocked it over. So, I started walking around the camp, scanning the area for any sign of where the wood might have gone. That's when I saw something else. Someone had drawn symbols in the dirt around my tent. I don't mean just one or two random shapes. It was a whole pattern, a series of lines and circles, arranged in a way that didn't make sense. The dirt was disturbed, like someone had been kneeling there for a long time, drawing carefully and slowly. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, staring at it. My mind raced. I tried to think of any logical explanation. Maybe some kids had wandered through the area and thought it'd be funny to mess with me. But no, there wasn't anyone else around. The place was quiet, and I hadn't seen anyone hiking nearby. The symbols, though, they didn't look like something a kid would draw. They looked deliberate. Thought out. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I thought about packing up and leaving, but that seemed like an overreaction. I mean, it was probably nothing, right? Just some weird coincidence. I gathered some more wood from the nearby area and built the fire. The flickering flames gave the whole scene an eerie glow. I tried to focus on the fire, on the crackling sound of the logs burning, but every now and then, I'd glance over at the symbols in the dirt. They kept pulling my attention. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the fire, but eventually, the feeling of unease grew too much. I couldn't shake the idea that someone was out there, just beyond the trees, watching me. And then it hit me. I hadn't heard any animals. Not a single bird call, no rustling in the trees, nothing. It was quiet. Too quiet. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the camp. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but the tension in the air was thick. I kept hearing things, small sounds that made my heart jump. A snap of a twig here, a rustle of leaves there. Every time I turned my head, though, there was nothing. I told myself I was just tired. Maybe I was getting into my own head. Maybe the symbols were just some odd, natural thing, like an animal making patterns in the dirt, or something left by a previous hiker. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I finished my dinner and sat there for a while, still staring at the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. The rustling, the small snaps of branches breaking. But it wasn't just the forest. Something felt wrong. Like there was someone else out there. The wind picked up, and I glanced around. The shadows were moving in strange ways now, the trees swaying as the wind picked up. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight from my pack, shining it around. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but something told me I needed to check the camp again. That's when I saw it. The symbols in the dirt were different. They weren't the same as before. The lines had shifted slightly, the circles were bigger, and the whole thing felt off. It was like someone had gone over them, changing things just enough that they weren't the same. My heart began to race. I walked around the camp, shining the light in every direction, but there was no one. No movement. Nothing. I turned back to my tent, my mind spinning. I just about had enough. I was ready to leave. I'd grab my stuff, pack it up, and head back to the car. But before I could make up my mind, I heard something. A noise. It came from behind me. Not from the woods, but from the direction of the tent. I turned around, slowly, shining the light towards it. And there, standing in the center of the camp, was a man. He wasn't close, but he wasn't far either. Just standing there in the shadows, staring at me. I don't know how long he had been standing there. I hadn't seen him approach. He wasn't making a sound, and his face was hidden in the darkness. But I could feel his presence. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the man turned and walked back into the trees. No words. No warning. Just disappeared. I waited a while, too scared to move. Then, I packed up everything I could grab in a rush and left. I didn't care about the fire or the wood or the symbols. I just needed to get out of there. I didn't stop until I was miles away, on the road, with the city lights in the distance. I've never been back to that spot. And I never will. It's been a few years now, but I still can't get the images out of my head. I know it sounds ridiculous, and maybe I'm just being paranoid, but there's no way I'm ever going back to that trail. I just can't. I was hiking alone, something I do pretty often. I'd been out there plenty of times before, just to get away from everything, you know? It's peaceful, being out there by yourself. No distractions, just you and the forest. So, I didn't think anything of it when I decided to go for a weekend hike, solo, up in the mountains. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a quick getaway from work and life. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, some food, and water, nothing special. I've done this enough times to know what I'm doing. The trail I was hiking was relatively quiet, not much traffic, which is what I preferred. I was about 5 miles in when I noticed a man. He was sitting beside his tent, just off the trail. It wasn't unusual to see other campers. There were a few spots along the trail where people set up camp, but this one struck me as odd. Not because of anything about his tent, it looked normal, like any other camping setup, but because he wasn't moving at all. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just tired. Some people set up camp early, and it was still a couple of hours before the sun would even start to set. I didn't wave or say anything, I just kept walking. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. He wasn't even looking up at me. He was just staring straight ahead, his back against his tent, like he was waiting for something or someone. He didn't even acknowledge me when I passed by, not even a glance. I called out hey in case he was just too focused on something to hear my footsteps, but he didn't respond. Not a flinch, not a shift of position, nothing. It was like I wasn't even there. Now, I'm not easily spooked, but that was odd. I didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't like he was asleep or anything, his eyes were wide open. He wasn't sick either. Just sitting there, like he was in some sort of trance, completely still. I didn't want to hang around, so I just kept walking. After a few minutes, I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe he was waiting for someone or just resting, and I was overthinking it. People have their quirks. So, I hiked the rest of the way to my camp, found a good spot by a small stream, set up my tent, and settled in for the night. The night passed uneventfully. The usual sounds of crickets, leaves rustling in the wind, the occasional owl. Everything felt normal. The next morning, I packed up and started heading back. I had a late start. The sun was already up when I broke camp, and I knew I'd need to move quickly if I wanted to get back before dark. It was an easy hike, just retracing my steps from the day before. And then I saw him again. It took me a moment to register what I was looking at. He was still sitting there. Same position, same spot, right by his tent. Exactly like the day before. I stopped in my tracks, trying to make sense of it. How could he still be sitting there, in the same position, for an entire night? I couldn't even tell if he'd moved at all. The sun had barely risen, but the light was enough to show that he was still there, his body stiff, his posture unchanged. I don't know why, but a cold feeling ran through me. Something wasn't right. I stood there, looking at him, wondering if I should say something. Maybe I should have checked if he was okay, but something about it made me hesitate. There was something off about it, like he was waiting for something that wasn't there. I decided to keep walking, not because I was scared, but because I didn't want to deal with whatever was happening. It didn't make sense, and I didn't want to make it worse by getting involved. I had to keep moving. But as I passed by again, I couldn't stop myself. I glanced over at him. He was still there. This time, I felt it more clearly, the unsettling thought that I had seen him in the exact same position the day before, and that he hadn't moved. It wasn't that he was just sitting there, it was that he seemed to be stuck in time. Like no matter how much the world around him had changed, he hadn't. I hurried past him, keeping my eyes ahead, and tried not to think about it. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. It wasn't normal. People don't just sit like that for hours on end, let alone an entire night. It was unnatural, but I couldn't explain why. The rest of the hike back felt like a blur. My mind kept racing, the image of him sitting there haunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what exactly. When I finally made it back to my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The whole experience seemed so strange, like something out of a bad dream. I just wanted to leave it all behind. But I haven't been able to forget it. The man's still there in my mind. And every time I think about it, I wonder why he never moved. Why didn't he leave, or at least get up, stretch, do something? Was he even alive? Was he waiting for someone? Was he? I haven't told anyone about this. I didn't want them to think I was crazy, and honestly, I don't know what I would say if I did. It just doesn't make sense. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. I've been back to that trail once since then, but only as far as the first overlook. I didn't even want to get close to where his tent had been. It's stupid, I know, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still there, waiting for something, and I don't want to find out what it is. I'm not sure what happened that day, but I know I'm not going back to find out. I've been hiking solo for years. I've done a lot of backcountry trails, so I like to think I know what I'm doing when it comes to navigation and staying on track. But something happened last summer that still messes with me. I went out for a 2-day solo hike in a forest I had been to a few times before. It was a well-traveled trail, marked with signs and arrows, and I was familiar with the path. I was looking forward to getting away from the noise of the city for a while, to clear my head and just enjoy the quiet of the woods. The first day went fine. The weather was nice, not too hot, with a slight breeze that kept things comfortable. I had a backpack with enough food, water, and gear for the hike. It was a simple loop, so I didn't expect any surprises. I moved along at a decent pace, stopping every so often to drink water or take a few photos of the scenery. Nothing unusual. Everything seemed as it should be. I came across a few people along the trail, but nothing too crowded. Most hikers were friendly, giving the usual nods or quick hellos, but nothing to hold me up. I got to the first camping area around late afternoon and set up my tent for the night. The next morning, I packed up and set out again, eager to make the most of the day. The trail was still the same, all marked with arrows that guided me. It was still early enough that the light was soft, the air crisp, and the forest still quiet except for the occasional bird call or the rustling of leaves underfoot. But about 2 hours into the hike, I started to notice something strange. I had been following the trail signs, just like I had the day before, but this time something caught my eye. One of the arrows had been twisted. At first, I thought I might be seeing things. The arrow was usually pointing to the right, but now it was pointing to the left, away from the trail I was following. I stopped for a moment and looked around. The trail I had been following seemed to stretch ahead, still clear and marked, but this arrow had definitely been turned. It wasn't just misaligned, it was purposefully twisted, as if someone had deliberately moved it. I'll admit, I wasn't immediately concerned. Maybe it was an old sign, maybe it had been moved by the wind or something. But as I stood there for a moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I double-checked the map I had, looking for any signs of confusion. But according to the map, I was still on the right path. So, I decided to continue on. I didn't want to waste time backtracking or doubting myself. But as I moved ahead, I noticed another arrow, further along the trail. And this one was twisted in the same direction, pointing off the trail, away from where I was supposed to be going. Now, I started to get a bit uneasy. I looked around carefully, trying to make sense of it. There was no sign of anyone else nearby. The trail was still quiet, and the forest seemed unchanged. The arrows didn't seem like they'd been damaged, they were simply pointing in a way that didn't match the usual trail direction. I thought maybe someone had been messing around, trying to throw people off. It didn't make sense, but I figured I'd keep following the marked signs anyway. I reasoned that maybe someone had rearranged them for some unknown reason, but it was unlikely that something bad could happen on such a well-traveled trail. Still, I hesitated for a moment. I checked my map again. The trail ahead was supposed to be a left turn, according to the map. But this arrow, this second twisted one, was pointing right, further off into the trees. I paused and looked at the trees in the distance. It looked like the path continued straight ahead, just as it had before, but something about the twisted arrow didn't sit right with me. It felt deliberate. I felt like I was being led somewhere. But where? I stood there for what felt like a long time, looking at the sign, looking ahead, then looking back. I don't know why, but I decided to follow the twisted arrows. Something about the curiosity of it just pulled me forward, even though a voice in the back of my mind told me to turn around. I moved off the path, feeling more and more unsettled as I did. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe I thought the trail would loop back around, or that I'd find a shortcut. But the further I walked, the more the surroundings changed. The trees grew thicker, the underbrush denser, and the trail became less defined. There was a sense of isolation that I hadn't felt before. The next sign was even more twisted. This time, it wasn't just an arrow pointing the wrong way, it was almost as if someone had dug into the ground to shift the sign so it pointed in the opposite direction. I felt my heart rate pick up, a strange, nagging feeling settling in my stomach. This was no mistake. This wasn't a random change. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. People go off the trail all the time, right? Maybe it was a shortcut that other hikers had taken, a little-known path that I just wasn't aware of. But then I saw something else. I spotted a tent. At first, I thought it might be someone else camping in the woods, maybe a hiker who had gotten off the trail. But no, there was no campfire, no other signs of life. The tent sat alone, just off the trail, looking like it had been there for some time. I walked over cautiously. There was no movement. No sound. I called out, just in case someone was inside, but there was no response. I stepped closer to the tent and peered inside. It was empty. But there was something wrong. Something about the way the tent was set up didn't sit right. The entrance was wide open, and the inside was too neat, almost too perfect, like no one had ever used it. No gear was lying around, no sleeping bags, no packs. I stepped back and glanced around, the feeling of dread growing stronger. I was no longer on the marked trail. I had wandered too far, and I knew it. But the trail signs were still there, still twisted, still pointing me forward. That's when I realized I didn't know how to get back. I couldn't remember the exact path I'd taken when I veered off, and I couldn't see any familiar landmarks. I tried to backtrack, but everything seemed different. The trees, the undergrowth, it all looked the same. I was disoriented. I don't know how long I spent trying to find my way back, but it felt like hours. Eventually, I stumbled across a familiar sign, one that was still pointing in the right direction, leading me back to the main trail. I didn't hesitate this time. I didn't care about the weird arrows or the empty tent. I just followed the path, quick and steady, until I was back on the main trail again, and I didn't stop until I was back in my car. I've never gone back to that trail, and I don't plan to. The thought that someone might have been messing with me, or worse, that I was being led off the path on purpose, keeps me awake at night. Something was wrong, and I'm not sure what it was, but I don't need to know. I'm done with that place. I'm still not sure if I should have said something to anyone about what happened that day. I can't quite shake the feeling that I'm overthinking it. It wasn't like I was in real danger, I think, but something just didn't sit right about it. I'd been hiking alone for a few years, and I'd done plenty of solo trips, so this didn't seem like it should be anything out of the ordinary. But the more I think back on it, the more things don't add up. It started on a Saturday morning. I had been itching for a hike for a while, and the weather was perfect, so I decided to take a quick trip out to one of my favorite trails. It wasn't too far from home, so I could make it a day hike and be back before dark. The trailhead was empty when I arrived, which I liked. I'm not really one for crowded hikes. The place was peaceful, and it was just what I needed to clear my head. The first part of the trail was familiar. I hiked it before. It was a well-trodden path that led through some thick woods, then up into a ridge with some nice views at the top. I wasn't rushing. I was just enjoying the quiet, the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt path, the birds overhead. I stopped now and then to take a photo or just to breathe in the fresh air. Everything was normal, and for a while, I didn't notice anything strange. Then I saw the first smear of blood. It wasn't much, just a small streak, like someone had brushed against a tree with something wet. At first, I thought it might have been a branch dripping sap or something. But as I looked closer, I saw the red color wasn't quite right. It looked like fresh blood, thin, almost watery, not dark like dried blood. I stood there for a minute, unsure of what to make of it. It wasn't huge, just a streak about the size of my hand, but it was odd. I thought it might be from an animal. Maybe a deer had been injured. That made sense to me at the time, so I didn't think too much of it. I just kept going. But as I walked further along the trail, I found more. About 100 yards later, there was another smear, a little bigger this time, this one on the bark of a bigger tree. It was on the lower part of the trunk, almost like something had brushed against it while it was moving. It was the same watery, fresh look. The further I went, the more I found. Every few hundred yards, there was another streak, sometimes on trees, sometimes on rocks, always leading deeper into the woods. The blood didn't seem to be pooling anywhere, but it was getting harder to ignore. After a while, I started to feel uncomfortable. I couldn't really explain why. There wasn't anything overtly threatening about it, but something about the constant trail of blood just felt off. I tried to convince myself that it was just an injured animal, maybe a bear or something, but the thought didn't sit right. Why would it keep bleeding in such a specific way, in such a straight line? It was almost like someone or something was leading me. At some point, I thought about turning back. But the trail was so familiar, and I had come this far. I figured I would keep going a little longer, just to see if I could find the source of the blood. Maybe I'd find an animal and it would make sense. But the further I went, the more I started to feel like something wasn't right. The woods felt different, like they were closing in around me. I know that sounds dramatic, but I started to feel a little more on edge with each passing minute. There was no one else on the trail. I hadn't seen anyone since I started, and the blood smears were starting to look more like a deliberate path rather than a random trail of an animal. Then I came to a clearing. It was just a small one, a patch of open ground surrounded by trees. The moment I stepped into it, I saw something else that made my stomach turn. A jacket. It was lying in the middle of the clearing, discarded like someone had left it there in a hurry. It wasn't a fancy jacket, just a simple fleece, but it was soaked in blood. There was more blood around it, pooled in the dirt, soaking into the fabric. My heart started racing. I didn't want to think about it, but I couldn't stop myself from imagining that whoever had been wearing that jacket might still be out there somewhere. I didn't touch the jacket. I just stood there, staring at it for a few seconds, trying to figure out what to do. Every instinct in me told me to turn around and head back to the trailhead, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than I was understanding. I started scanning the trees around me, but all I saw were more trees. Nothing out of the ordinary. No movement, no sound. But then, just on the edge of my vision, I noticed something, another smear of blood. It led further into the woods, disappearing into the thicker part of the forest. It was like the blood trail was pulling me in deeper, beckoning me to follow. I don't know why I did it, but I followed it. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and I needed to know what. I pushed through the trees, keeping my eyes on the ground, watching the bloodstains lead me deeper into the woods. The trail led me to a small creek, and that's when I saw him. A man, sitting on a log by the creek. He wasn't facing me, but I could see the back of his head, his body hunched slightly. He wasn't moving, and his clothes looked dirty, like he'd been out there for a while. He didn't acknowledge me when I stopped, but the first thing I noticed was the blood. His clothes were stained with it, and there was a pool of blood at his feet. I froze. I didn't know what to do. He hadn't heard me, hadn't seen me, and I just stood there, staring at him, my heart pounding. I didn't want to get any closer, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Finally, after what felt like forever, he stood up slowly. He didn't look at me, he just rose to his feet, swayed slightly, and then started walking further into the woods. The blood was dripping from him, like he was still bleeding, but he didn't seem to care. He just kept walking, not fast, but with purpose, like he knew exactly where he was going. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know if I should approach him or run, but I didn't stay. I turned around and ran back the way I came, keeping my eyes forward, not looking back once. When I got back to the trailhead, I didn't stop to talk to anyone. I just got in my car and drove home. The whole time, I kept thinking about that man, about the blood, and about what I had just seen. I never told anyone what happened. I don't think they would have believed me. I went out camping alone because I needed to clear my head. Just one night, not too far from town. I had done it before, nothing special. Pack light, tent, sleeping bag, little burner, just the basics. I picked a spot by a creek, not far off the trail. It was quiet. Only noise was the water and birds now and then. Set up camp around midday, got a little fire going by sunset. I didn't see anyone on the trail heading in, which suited me fine. I liked being out there on my own. Felt better that way. No distractions. I made some food, sat by the fire, watched the light fade. It was cold but not too bad. Nothing strange happened that night. I stayed up a bit, then turned in when the fire started dying down. Slept through without waking up once. When I got up the next morning, the sun was just starting to come up. I got out of the tent to stretch, walked a little way to the creek to wash my face. That's when I saw it. The note was pinned to a tree, maybe 10 feet from my tent. Just a little scrap of paper, folded in half, stuck through with a twig. I don't know how I didn't notice it before. I walked over, still half asleep, and pulled it down. I've been watching you since yesterday. I read it twice, then 3 times. The handwriting was messy, almost like it had been scratched out in a rush. Just those words, nothing else. My stomach felt tight all of a sudden. I turned around, scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the creek and the wind through the branches. I stood there holding the note for what felt like a long time. Tried to tell myself it was just some prank. Maybe someone passing through the area the day before, messing around. But the more I thought about it, the less that made sense. Nobody was out there. I hadn't seen a soul since I left my car. I told myself to pack up and head back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Every time the wind moved the trees, I felt like something was shifting just out of sight. I kept turning around, trying to catch someone in the corner of my eye, but there was never anything there. I packed up quicker than I ever have. Rolled up the tent, stuffed everything into my pack, kept checking behind me the whole time. I still had about 3 miles to hike back to the car. The whole way, I kept hearing little sounds. Twigs snapping, branches shifting, like someone was always just a little too far to see. I tried to keep moving, not think too much about it. But about halfway back, I found another note. This one was pinned to a low branch right by the trail. Same kind of paper, same handwriting. You're walking too fast. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, gripping my pack straps so tight my hands were shaking. I couldn't see anyone. The woods were dead quiet, not even birds anymore. I wanted to run, but I was afraid if I started, I wouldn't stop. Or worse, something would chase me. I forced myself to keep walking. Slower this time, like maybe that would make whoever was out there lose interest. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, but I never heard anything close. Just those little sounds way off in the trees. I kept expecting another note to show up, pinned to a tree or tucked under a rock. But there was nothing else. I made it back to the car by early afternoon. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the keys twice trying to unlock the door. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and locked the doors before I even started the engine. Sat there for a long time, just watching the trailhead, half expecting someone to come walking out of the woods. Nobody did. I don't know who left those notes. I don't know if they were watching me the whole time or just messing with me. I thought about going to the police, but what would I even tell them? No footprints, no signs of anyone else out there. Just 2 scraps of paper with handwriting I've never seen before. I haven't been back out since. Probably never will. It was supposed to be one of those easy trips. Just 3 days out in the woods, nothing too far. Me, Eric, Joel, and Liam. We'd done a couple of hikes together before, but this one wasn't anything serious. Just a few miles out to this lake spot Eric knew. No cell service, no cabins, just a fire pit and some flat ground for tents. That was what we wanted. We got there around 4, set up camp, and got the fire going while there was still light. It was nice, at first. The air was cooling down, and the whole place was quiet. You could hear the water lapping at the shore if you listened close. No one else was out there. It felt like we had the whole place to ourselves. We stayed up until maybe midnight, drinking and messing around. The fire was low, and I was about ready to crawl into my tent when we heard it. Crying. It was faint at first. Just this soft, thin sound coming from the woods behind us. The kind of noise you almost convince yourself you're imagining. I remember how we all went quiet at the same time. No one said anything, just listening. It sounded like a woman. Not sobbing, more like whimpering. Broken up, shaky. Liam called out, just a quick, hello, but nothing answered. We listened for another minute or 2. The crying would stop, then start again, always faint, always coming from the same direction. Way off in the trees. Joel was the first one to say it. That it was probably an animal, maybe a fox. They can sound like that sometimes. It made sense when he said it, but none of us really believed it. Not out loud. We ended up letting it go. None of us were about to start wandering into the woods in the middle of the night, not over something like that. It felt weird, sure, but the sound was far enough away that it was easy to pretend it wasn't our problem. I barely slept, though. I could hear it off and on through the night, way out there in the dark. Sometimes it was so faint I thought it had stopped, then it would pick up again, always the same tone, same rhythm. Like whoever it was hadn't moved at all. By morning, I was half convinced I dreamed the whole thing. No one really talked about it while we made breakfast, just kind of acted like it hadn't happened. But when the sun was fully up and the coffee kicked in, Eric said we should check it out, just in case. It was one of those things none of us wanted to suggest first, but nobody wanted to be the guy to say no either. So we grabbed a couple of knives, just to feel better, and walked out into the woods. We didn't hear anything at first. The further we went, the thicker the trees got, and the quieter everything felt. After maybe 15 minutes, we stopped to listen. Nothing. I was about ready to turn back when Liam spotted it. A little patch of disturbed leaves, like something had been dragged or kicked around. Eric started poking through it with his boot, and that's when we saw the corner of something plastic sticking out. He bent down and pulled it free. It was a Bluetooth speaker. One of those cheap little ones you can buy at gas stations. It was still on. There was this tiny blue light blinking on the side, and when Eric turned the volume knob, the crying started again. Exactly the same sound we heard the night before. I think we all just stood there staring at it for a second, not really processing what we were looking at. It was one of those moments where your brain tries to line things up in a way that makes sense, but nothing fits. Joel kept saying it was some kind of prank, like maybe some kids had set it up. But there weren't any other camps around, and nobody hikes out that far just to mess with people. Besides, who would have been out here all night waiting for someone to find it? Eric turned the speaker off and stuffed it into his pack without saying anything. We walked back to camp in silence. The whole mood was different after that. None of us wanted to admit we were freaked out, but I could feel it. We packed up sooner than we planned, broke down the tents, and started the hike back to the trucks by late morning. The whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about how far the speaker was from camp. The crying had sounded faint, like it was way off in the woods. But if that little speaker was making the noise, someone had to have put it there just far enough to mess with us without getting too close. Someone watched us set up camp. They listened to us sitting around the fire. Then they walked out into the woods and left that speaker playing. I don't know how long they stayed or how close they got after we went to sleep. None of us ever talked about it again. Eric threw the speaker away as soon as we got back to the trucks. He didn't even want it in the car with us. I haven't been camping since. I've been hiking alone for a few years now. It's not something I talk about much because people always have the same reactions, that it's dangerous, that women shouldn't be out by themselves like that. I always told myself those people were paranoid. If you know what you're doing, if you're smart about where you go and what you bring, there's nothing to be scared of. I still believe that, mostly. But I haven't gone back out since this happened. It was late September, just starting to cool down. I drove out to a state forest about 2 hours from where I live, not one of those touristy places with gift shops and cabins. Just woods. I'd done the trail before. 8 miles, out and back, not too steep. The plan was to get there early, finish by mid-afternoon, and be back at my car before the sun started going down. I didn't see anyone when I parked. The lot was half full, but the cars looked like they belonged to people who had probably stayed overnight. I remember feeling good about that. I liked knowing there were people out there somewhere, but not close enough to bother me. I started off around 7. The first few miles were nice, just trees and birds, no road noise, nothing. I didn't see another person the whole time. I kept thinking how lucky I was to have the place to myself. Around mile 4, there's this clearing where the trees thin out on one side and you can see down into the valley. I stopped there to eat something and rest a little. I was sitting on this flat rock, facing out toward the view, when I saw him. He was off the trail, maybe 30 yards down the slope, just standing there between the trees. Black hoodie, dark pants. Hands in his pockets. He was facing away from me, looking down into the valley. I watched him for a minute, trying to figure out if he was with someone or waiting for someone. He wasn't moving, not shifting his weight or looking around. Just standing there. The whole time I watched him, he never turned or made any sign he knew I was there. It made me nervous, but I told myself not to overthink it. People go out in the woods to be alone all the time, that's what I was doing. Just because he was acting a little weird didn't mean anything. I packed up my stuff and kept walking. For the next mile or so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time the trail curved, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Nothing. I even stopped once and listened, just to be sure. The woods were quiet. I picked up my pace after that. I didn't see him again until almost 2 miles later. The trail crossed a dry creek bed with a little footbridge built over it. I was halfway across when I looked up and saw him standing on the hill to my left, maybe 50 yards away. Same clothes, same posture, hands in his pockets, back to me. Closer. I don't know how long he'd been there before I saw him. He must have cut through the woods, off trail. There was no other way he could have gotten ahead of me. I stood there on the bridge for a minute, trying to convince myself it wasn't the same guy. But it was. I knew it was. I thought about calling out to him. Just something casual, "Hey, you good?" Like I wasn't scared. But something about him made me keep my mouth shut. I walked faster after that. Every time I went around a bend or came up over a hill, I kept waiting to see him again. I started hearing noises in the woods, little snaps and rustles, but I couldn't tell if it was him or just my own footsteps echoing back at me. I've been out in the woods enough to know what animals sound like. This wasn't that. It was slow. Careful. I didn't see him again until I was almost back to the car. Maybe half a mile from the parking lot, there's this long stretch where the trail straightens out, and you can see ahead for a good 100 yards. He was standing right at the edge of the path. Closer than ever. Still facing away. I stopped walking. I don't know how long I stood there watching him, but he never moved. His hands were still stuffed down in his pockets, his hood pulled up so I couldn't see anything except the shape of his head. I remember thinking if he turned around, I would run. I don't know why that was what scared me the most, the idea of seeing his face. I waited until I couldn't hear anything except the blood pounding in my ears, then I started walking again. Slow. Trying not to make any noise. I kept my eyes on him the whole time. The trail took me maybe 20 feet from where he was standing, close enough that I could see the dirt on the backs of his shoes. He never turned. Never shifted. I kept walking. When I finally made it back to the lot, there were 2 other cars still parked, both empty. I threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time with the engine running. I kept watching the trailhead, waiting to see him step out of the woods. He never did. I drove home with all the windows rolled up, checking the rearview mirror every few minutes like an idiot. I don't know what he was doing out there. I don't know how long he followed me or how close he got while I was sleeping in the clearing. I don't know if he ever turned around. I don't think I ever want to know. I wasn't even supposed to camp there. It was a last-minute thing. I'd been driving most of the day, heading north to visit my brother, but I left late and got tired faster than I thought I would. The campsite wasn't one of those marked ones, just to pull off with enough space for a tent and a fire pit someone had made out of rocks a long time ago. I almost didn't stop. It was off a dirt road, way out past a couple of logging trails. No signs, no lights. But I'd been driving too long, and it was either sleep there or keep going another 2 hours in the dark. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and ate some canned soup. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses down on you when you're out there by yourself. I kept checking the woods without meaning to, turning my head every time the fire crackled. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the trees. Around 10, I killed the fire and got into the tent. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. I had to take a piss, so I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold. That's when I tripped. It wasn't anything big, just something buried in the dirt by the fire pit. I caught myself before I hit the ground, but my heart was going hard from the jolt. The flashlight beam swept over the spot, and I saw this little corner of plastic sticking up from the dirt. I don't know why I didn't just leave it alone. I crouched down and brushed the loose soil away. The plastic was thick, cloudy. One of those vacuum-sealed bags. It was buried shallow, not even 6 inches down. I pulled it free and held it up to the light. Inside was a handgun. Black, small, something cheap, probably. And a wallet. I froze when I saw the wallet. I didn't want to open it. I stood there for a long time with it in my hands, staring at the outline of a card tucked behind the plastic window. I could already see there was a photo on it. My stomach felt like it was trying to crawl up into my throat. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally unzipped the bag. The wallet was damp, the leather swollen from being in the ground. I slid the ID out with my thumb. It was a man's face, maybe mid-30s. White guy, short hair. His name was Brian Kelter. I knew that name. I didn't know how at first, but I knew it. Then it clicked. I'd seen it on a flyer. One of those missing person posters they put up at gas stations. I couldn't remember exactly where, but it was recent, maybe a few months back. I just stood there holding it. My breath was fogging out in front of me, and I remember how loud it sounded. The whole time I was standing there, I kept looking at the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling someone was watching me. I wanted to believe it was old, that someone had buried it there a year ago or something. But the dirt was loose. The bag was barely under the surface. Whoever left it there did it recently. The gun was loaded. I don't know why I checked, but I did. 5 bullets. I didn't know what to do. My phone was in the tent, but there was no service out there anyway. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the idea of turning my back on the woods scared me more than staying. I ended up locking the gun back in the bag and stuffing it in the bottom of my pack. I don't know why. I guess I thought if someone came back looking for it, they'd see it was gone and move on. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up in the tent with my knife in my hand, listening. Every little sound outside made my skin crawl, branches shifting, leaves rustling, something moving through the brush way off in the dark. Around 4, I heard footsteps. They came from the direction of the road, slow and careful. I could hear the weight in them, not an animal. They circled the camp once, crunching through the leaves, then stopped. Right outside my tent. I held my breath so long my chest started to ache. I could see the shadow through the nylon, just this faint shape standing there. They stayed for maybe 2 minutes. Then the footsteps started again, moving back into the trees. I waited until it was light before I packed up. I hiked back to the road, but I didn't see anyone. My car was right where I left it. I drove straight to the nearest town and found a gas station with service. I tried looking up the name on the ID, but all I found were old articles saying he'd been reported missing 9 months ago. I thought about going to the police. I should have gone to the police. I kept driving. I still have the wallet. It's in a shoebox in my closet. I threw the gun in a river 2 counties over. I don't know if that was the right thing to do, but I couldn't carry it around, and I couldn't stand the idea of handing it off to somebody else. I keep thinking about how shallow it was buried. Like whoever put it there wanted someone to find it. Like maybe they were watching to see who would. I don't go camping alone anymore. I used to all the time. I liked being out by myself, where it was quiet. I thought if you were careful and picked the right spots, there was nothing to be scared of. This was last summer. It was a free campsite, just a clearing by a lake with a fire ring someone had set up years ago. I'd been there once before with a couple of friends, but this time I went by myself. The place is out in the middle of nowhere, maybe 45 minutes down a dirt road off the highway. No cell service, nothing. I got there around 3 in the afternoon. There was one other car parked off to the side when I pulled up, but I didn't see anyone around. I figured they were hiking or out on the water. I walked down to the lake to check things out, but the whole place was empty. I set up my tent about 20 feet from the fire ring, facing the lake. I always liked hearing the water at night. It made everything feel a little less alone. I built a fire, ate dinner, and watched the sun go down. It was one of those hot nights where the woods go dead quiet after dark, no wind, barely any bugs. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. I went into the tent around 10. I left the rain flap open so I could see the sky through the mesh, and I laid there for a long time just listening to the water lapping on the shore. I don't know what time it was when I heard it. Late. It was soft at first, so quiet I thought I imagined it. Click. I sat up and listened. It was close. Maybe 10 feet from the tent. Click. Like a camera shutter. I told myself it was a branch snapping or something settling in the woods. I lay back down, trying not to think about it. Then I heard it again. Click. I sat up fast that time, heart going in my chest. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Just the trees and the lake behind them. I stayed like that for a long time, half in and half out of the tent, shining the light into the woods. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything. After a while, I convinced myself I was imagining it, maybe something shifting in the fire ring as the ashes cooled. I zipped the tent back up and laid down again. I don't think I ever really fell asleep after that. It was around 3 when I heard footsteps. Slow. Careful. Coming from the direction of the road. I sat up and grabbed my knife from my pack. I could see the shadow of the trees through the mesh, but there was nothing moving. The steps stopped just outside the beam of my flashlight. I stayed frozen like that, holding my breath, knife in my hand. Then I heard it. Click. Right outside the tent. I snapped the flashlight on and shone it out through the mesh. There was nobody there. I unzipped the tent just a little, just enough to poke the light through. I swept it back and forth across the clearing, but the woods were empty. My car was still parked where I left it. The ashes in the fire ring were cold. I kept the knife in my hand the whole time, heart slamming in my chest. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe it was a branch breaking under its own weight, or some bird I didn't know the sound of. Then I saw them. Footprints. They started at the edge of the clearing, right where the woods thinned out, and came straight toward my tent. Clear in the dirt, heel, toe, like someone had walked right up to me. But there were no prints leading away. I waited in that tent until the sun started coming up. I don't know if I slept or not. I think I must have blacked out for a while because the next thing I remember was the light coming through the trees. When I finally got out of the tent, I checked all around the site. There were more footprints near the road, just a few, like someone had been standing there watching. They were deep, like they'd been there for a long time. I packed everything up as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. The whole time, I kept looking back at the woods, expecting someone to step out. I didn't see anyone. When I got to my car, there was something tucked under the windshield wiper. A Polaroid. It was a picture of me, taken through the mesh of the tent. I've been hiking alone for years. Never had a bad experience until this. I don't even know if I'll go back out again after what happened. It was late September, still warm during the day but cold at night. I wanted one last trip before winter, so I picked a 3-day loop through the national forest. Nothing crazy, about 30 miles total. I started early the first morning and made good time, set up camp by the river around 5. The second day, I planned to hit the ridge and follow it back toward the trailhead. It was supposed to be the hardest stretch, steep climbs, narrow switchbacks. I was maybe 4 miles in when I found him. At first, I thought it was a dead animal. There was this shape slumped against a tree off the trail, half hidden by brush. He was sitting with his back to the trunk, knees pulled up, arms wrapped around them. No pack, no shoes. His clothes were filthy, torn up jeans and a jacket that looked like it had been soaked and dried a dozen times over. I stood there a few seconds, trying to figure out if he was asleep or hurt. Then he turned his head. His eyes were bloodshot, sunken deep into his face. He was maybe mid-40s, beard patchy and overgrown. His lips were cracked, and his skin looked gray under the dirt. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me like he couldn't figure out if I was real. I asked if he was okay. He nodded, slow. I asked if he needed help. He didn't answer. I got closer, maybe 10 feet away. I could smell him. Sweat, piss, something else underneath. He kept watching me without blinking. I asked how long he'd been out there. "Couple days," he said. His voice was low, scratchy, like he hadn't used it in a while. He asked if I had any water. I handed him my spare bottle, keeping my distance. He took 2 sips and just held it in his lap, staring at the ground. I asked if he had a camp nearby or if he was lost. He nodded again, not to either question, just this slow, empty nod like he wasn't really listening. I told him I could walk him back to the main trail, that I had a map and GPS. He didn't answer. I stood there waiting, feeling the silence press down. The whole time, he kept staring at the ground like he was thinking something over. Then he looked at me and said, "I'll follow." That's how he said it. Not "I'll come with you" or "okay." Just those 2 words. I turned around and started walking. He came out of the brush without making a sound. He didn't ask where we were going or how far. Just fell in behind me, maybe 10 feet back. I kept glancing over my shoulder every few steps. He never looked up, just stared at the ground while he walked. I tried talking to him, asking where he came from, if someone was looking for him. He never answered, just kept moving one slow step at a time. After about half a mile, the trail curved along the edge of a ravine. I stopped to let him catch up. He stopped when I stopped. I waited a few seconds, then started walking again. He waited the same few seconds, then started walking again. That was when I realized he wasn't following me to the trail. He was following me. I picked up my pace. He did too. I stopped again, pretending to adjust my pack. He stopped. I turned around and looked at him straight on for the first time since we started walking. His head was down, hair hanging in front of his face. His hands were clenched into fists. I asked if he was sure he didn't want to walk in front so I could keep an eye on him, tried to laugh like it was a joke. He didn't even smile. "I'll follow," he said again. I don't know why, but those words made something twist up inside me. I kept walking. Every time I glanced back, he was just there, 10 feet behind, always staring at the ground. We walked like that for hours. I thought about breaking into a run, but I was miles from anywhere. He'd seen my pack, my gear, my knife. He knew I had food and water. If he chased me, I wouldn't get far with all that weight. I kept telling myself he was just some lost hiker, maybe off his meds, maybe dehydrated. But something was wrong with him. He wasn't all there. His face never changed, not once. By the time the sun started dipping low, I knew I couldn't camp out there with him following me. I made up some excuse about needing to get back to the trailhead by dark. Told him I could radio for help when I got there. He didn't even look at me. I kept walking. Faster now. He kept pace. Another hour passed, maybe 2. The shadows stretched long across the trail, and the light started draining out of the sky. That's when I heard it. His footsteps were softer, slower. I glanced back. He wasn't there. I stopped and turned all the way around. The trail was empty. My whole body went tight. I stood there listening, but the woods were dead quiet. No wind, no birds. Just the blood pounding in my ears. I stayed like that for a long time, waiting. Nothing. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally started walking again, faster this time, almost jogging. I made it another half-mile before I saw him. He was standing off the trail, maybe 20 feet into the trees. Just standing there, half hidden behind a trunk. His face was pale in the fading light, eyes locked on me. He didn't blink. He didn't move. I don't know how long he'd been there or how he got ahead of me. I didn't say anything. I just kept walking. I pushed harder, almost running with my head down. My legs were burning, sweat soaking through my shirt. Every time I glanced back, he was there, always in the trees, always watching. He followed me all the way down the ridge. The sun went down, and the woods got dark fast. I kept my headlamp off as long as I could, listening for footsteps behind me. When I finally flicked it on, he was gone. I hiked straight through the night. Didn't stop once. I reached the trailhead around 6 in the morning, legs shaking so bad I could barely stand. My car was the only one in the lot. I sat there with the doors locked until the sun was fully up, watching the tree lean. I never saw him come out. I don't know what he was or what he wanted. I reported it to the rangers, but they didn't find anyone matching his description. No missing persons. No campsites gone cold. They said maybe he was some drifter or squatter living out there. That happens sometimes. But that doesn't explain how he moved like that. How he always knew where I was going. I still dream about him sometimes. I'll be walking through the woods, and I'll hear footsteps behind me. Slow, steady. When I turn around, there's nobody there. Then I'll hear it, right by my ear. I'll follow. I went on that trip with 3 friends, Nate, Jason, and Tim. We've done the same loop every fall for a few years now. Nothing too far out, just 3 nights in the woods, maybe 25 miles altogether. Enough to feel like we were getting away without pushing too hard. The first day was fine. We hiked in about 8 miles and set up near the lake by late afternoon. The place was pretty empty, only passed 2 other groups the whole day. One couple heading back out and some older guy on his own with a fishing pole. He didn't say much when we passed him, just nodded and kept walking. That night was normal. We sat around the fire, drank a little, turned in early. Nothing weird. The next morning, we packed up and got moving by 10. The trail curved around the lake, then climbed into thicker woods. Maybe 2 miles in, Jason spotted the camera. It was one of those cheap disposable ones, the kind with the little plastic wheel you have to crank between shots. It was sitting right in the middle of the path. No mud on it, no scratches. Just sitting there like somebody had placed it down on purpose. Tim picked it up and joked about taking selfies with it. We all laughed, but something about it felt off. It wasn't that weird to find stuff out there. People drop gear all the time, but usually not something like that. Most people hike with their phones now. Jason said we should check if there was any film left. He cranked the wheel, then clicked the shutter at the trees. It still worked. The film wasn't done. We figured maybe whoever lost it would be at the next campsite or trailhead, so we stuffed it in a side pocket and kept walking. By late afternoon, we made it to the second site, a little clearing by the creek with a fire ring and enough flat ground for our tents. Nobody else around. We got the fire going, cooked dinner, same routine. I don't know what made Nate pull the camera back out. I think he was just bored. He started cranking through the film, holding it up to the light after every click like he could see something through the plastic window. Halfway through, he stopped. He held it out and asked if anyone wanted to see. Tim took it first. His face changed as soon as he looked. There were pictures on it. Most of them were regular hiking shots, trees, rivers, the lake. A couple blurry ones of somebody's boots. Nothing strange. Then Tim handed it to me. The second to last picture was the fire ring at our first campsite. Our campsite. You could see the logs we sat on, the empty beer cans, the burnt foil from dinner still crumpled on the rocks. It was taken at night, after we'd gone to bed. The last picture was worse. It was from that morning, maybe an hour before we found the camera. It showed our campsite again, but closer this time. You could see the tents. You could see my red jacket draped over a branch, still damp from the night before. None of us had seen anyone that morning. Not a single person. Nobody said anything for a long time. We tried to come up with explanations. Maybe the couple we passed had doubled back. Maybe the fisherman was messing with us. But why would anyone leave the camera behind? Nate wanted to hike back out right then. Jason talked him down, said it was probably nothing. Just some hiker with a weird sense of humor. I didn't believe that, but I didn't want to be the one to say we should leave. By the time the sun went down, we all convinced ourselves it was fine. I couldn't sleep. Every time the wind rustled the trees, I sat up and listened. I kept picturing someone standing just out of sight, holding another camera. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was still dark, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. The fire was out. Everything was dead quiet. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow, careful. Just 1 or 2 steps at a time. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The steps circled the tents, not close, but not far either. I kept waiting for one of the guys to wake up and say something, but nobody did. I don't know how long I laid there listening. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been an hour. Eventually, the footsteps faded off into the woods. I didn't sleep again after that. Nobody mentioned hearing anything in the morning. I didn't bring it up. We packed up and hiked out like normal. None of us talked much that day. It wasn't until we got back to the cars that Nate said what I'd been thinking the whole time. Whoever left the camera wanted us to find it. We never got the film developed. Jason said he would, but he never did. I think he just threw the whole thing away. None of us have been back out there since. I camp alone sometimes. Been doing it for years. Nothing too crazy, just state parks or smaller spots off the trails. Never more than 2 nights. I like the quiet, and I always felt safer out there than I did in a city. This happened last summer. I've been sitting on it for months, trying to forget, but I can't. I was in a smaller park about 3 hours from home. Weeknight trip. There was maybe 2 or 3 other campsites taken when I signed in, but I never saw anyone else the whole time. I picked a spot further back, close to the tree line, with a little creek running behind it. First night was fine. Made a fire, cooked some freeze-dried stuff, read a bit. Turned in early. The next day, I went for a hike along the creek. Just wandering, nothing marked. I walked maybe 2 miles out before heading back. About halfway, I stopped to take a break near this little rock outcrop by the water. I was off the main trail, no signs, no markers. Looked like nobody had been back there in a while. I was sitting on a log, drinking water, when I saw it half buried under some branches behind a dead tree. A cooler. One of those old hard plastic ones with a latch on the front. Blue with a white lid. At first, I thought someone stashed beers or something, maybe hiding it from park rangers. It happens. When I went to check it, the latch was locked. A little padlock looped through the front. That's what made me stop. Nobody locks a cooler unless they're hiding something. I should have left it. I know that now. I pulled it out from under the branches, dragged it into the light. It was heavier than I expected. Dirty, like it had been out there a while. The lock wasn't rusty, though newer, maybe a couple months old at most. I sat there staring at it, trying to decide if I should just leave it. Then I remembered I had a multi-tool in my pack with one of those little wire cutters on it. It took a few minutes, but I snapped the lock off. Inside, everything was sealed in Ziploc bags. The first bag I pulled out was full of clothes. Folded shirts, socks, underwear. All kid-sized. Some were pink, others blue. None of them looked dirty or torn, just old. Under that was another bag, stuffed with Polaroid pictures. I didn't want to open it, but I did. The first few were just tents of different colors, different sizes, like they were taken at random campsites. No people. Just empty tents in the woods. Then I got to the next ones. People sleeping inside. Close-ups taken through mesh windows. Some were blurry, like whoever took them was trying not to use a flash. Others were clear, faces half covered by blankets, mouths hanging open. One showed a woman curled up with a little kid tucked against her chest. None of them looked posed. Nobody was awake. I went through every picture. There had to be 50, maybe more. I didn't recognize anyone, but the backgrounds looked like places I'd camped before. Nothing that stood out, just the same kind of state parks and small sites I always used. At the bottom of the cooler, under all the bags, was a little spiral notebook sealed in plastic. I only flipped through it for a second. Most of the pages were blank, but some had lists of dates and locations. No names. Just places. I didn't want to know what the dates meant. I packed everything back inside, snapped the lid shut, and pushed the whole cooler back under the brush where I found it. I hiked straight back to camp, packed up, and left. Didn't even stay for the second night. I thought about telling someone, park rangers, police, but I didn't know how to explain why I broke the lock or why I didn't just leave it alone. It's been almost a year, and I still check the news sometimes for missing hikers or weird reports from that area. Nothing ever comes up. I wish I'd never opened it. This happened a few months ago, and I still think about it almost every day. I keep telling myself it was just some weird coincidence or maybe some random person messing around, but I can't shake it. I don't know if I'll ever go camping again after this. It started as a normal trip, just me and my girlfriend, Sarah. We've been wanting to go camping for a while, just to disconnect and spend some quiet time together. We picked a spot at a national forest a couple of hours from the city, one of those spots you've probably never heard of unless you go looking for it. There were a couple of other campsites around, but it wasn't too busy, and the weather was perfect. We set up our tent by a little creek, surrounded by trees. It was peaceful, or at least it was supposed to be. That first night was fine. We made a fire, cooked some food, talked, and just enjoyed being outside. The night came quick, as it usually does in the woods, and we settled into the tent around 10 p.m. We didn't bring anything fancy with us, just sleeping bags and a little flashlight. Sarah fell asleep pretty fast. I was still awake, staring up at the tent roof, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was nice. Quiet. Nothing out of the ordinary. Around 2:30 in the morning, I woke up to something strange. It was the zipper of the tent, or at least, that's what I thought it was at first. It was barely audible but distinct enough to make me freeze. I could hear the faint sound of the zipper being pulled down, and my heart just skipped a beat. Sarah was still asleep beside me, and I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't move, didn't say anything. I tried to convince myself I was just imagining things. Maybe it was the wind or the fabric rubbing together. But I knew what I heard. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Too silent. No wind, no crickets, no rustling leaves. It felt wrong. I stayed still for what felt like forever, trying to listen for anything else. And then I heard it, footsteps. Not heavy, but slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around the tent, making sure not to make too much noise. I couldn't see anything. The flashlight was out of reach, and we had no windows in the tent to peek through. But I heard the footsteps clear as day, circling around us. One step, then another, and then silence. Then it would start again. Around and around the tent. I wanted to wake Sarah, but I couldn't move. I didn't want to make a sound, in case whoever it was outside would hear me. It felt like the world had gone completely still, except for those footsteps. The person would pause, sometimes right next to the tent, sometimes at the other side. I couldn't tell how long this went on, but it felt like hours. Every time I thought it was over, I'd start to relax, but then I'd hear the footsteps again, faint at first, then louder, as if they were coming back. They'd circle and stop and circle again. At one point, I heard something that sounded like a faint breath, just outside the tent. I could feel my pulse racing, my hands cold with sweat, but I stayed as still as possible. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. I was trying to think of what to do, but I couldn't come up with any plan. I didn't know if I should grab the knife we had in the tent or call for help. I didn't even know who I'd call. We were in the middle of nowhere. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and our phones had no signal. Then I heard something else. A voice. It was barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It came from the direction of the tent entrance. "I know you're in there." I couldn't believe it. I thought maybe I was hearing things. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But the voice was clear, and it sounded normal. Like it could have been anyone. No growling, no weird distortion, just a soft, almost calm voice, as if they were just talking to us through the fabric of the tent. I froze, holding my breath, hoping whoever it was wouldn't hear my heart thumping in my chest. I glanced over at Sarah. She hadn't woken up. Her face was peaceful, like she had no idea what was happening. I didn't want to wake her. I didn't know what to do. The footsteps started again, slow and steady, but now they weren't just circling. They were getting closer, stepping right up to the edge of the tent, and I could feel the weight of them, like someone was standing right next to us. I held my breath again, barely daring to move. I don't know how long it lasted, but at some point, the footsteps stopped. There was no more breathing, no more voice, just the quiet that followed. I waited, holding my breath, praying that whoever it was had finally left. But it was like time had stopped. Every second felt like an eternity. Eventually, after what seemed like the longest period of silence, I slowly unzipped the flap of the tent just enough to peek outside. I didn't see anyone. There was nothing. Just the dark trees, the creek, and the faint outline of the campfire we'd left burning, now nothing more than a pile of embers. I grabbed Sarah's arm and shook her awake. She stirred but didn't fully open her eyes. I told her we needed to pack up and leave, but I couldn't bring myself to say what had really happened. I didn't want to scare her more than I already had. I just kept saying we needed to go. We packed up in a hurry, still in a haze from the night. It was only when we were halfway to the car that I turned around to look back at the tent. And that's when I saw it. In the dirt, just outside the door, was a single, clear footprint. A bare footprint, fresh and deep in the soft earth. We didn't stay another night. We didn't even finish packing up the campsite. We just drove straight home, and I haven't been camping since. I don't know who it was, or what they wanted. I don't know why they were out there, circling our tent for hours. But I know one thing for sure, whoever it was, they weren't lost. They knew exactly what they were doing. It was late in the afternoon when I came across it, a small, almost unnoticeable object hidden beneath a rock. I'd been hiking alone for about 3 days, well off the usual trail, just trying to get some peace and solitude. There were a few other hikers here and there, but it was quiet. I liked it that way. The kind of isolation where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional animal rustling somewhere in the distance. I was rounding a bend when I saw the rock. It was slightly out of place, more jagged than the others around it, almost like it had been placed there deliberately. Without much thought, I stepped over and knelt down. It wasn't the rock itself that caught my attention, but what was hidden beneath it. A phone. Not just any phone, it was still on, the screen glowing faintly in the dimming light. It was a cheap, old model, one of those low-budget things you don't see much anymore. My first instinct was to just leave it. I mean, who leaves their phone behind like this? I thought maybe it was just some kind of mistake or something someone had dropped. But then, I saw it, the emergency call still running on the screen. The timer on the call was going, and the phone was still showing emergency call in progress. I squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of it, but the signal was weak. There was no way anyone could have made a call this far into the woods unless something went seriously wrong. My heart rate picked up, and for a moment, I considered walking away, just pretending I hadn't seen it. After all, it wasn't my business, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I don't know what it was, but I felt the need to know more. I turned the phone over, and there was a crack across the back of it, like it had been dropped hard, maybe even stomped on. That didn't exactly help the suspicion creeping up my spine. I wondered how long it had been there, how long someone had been out here, alone, calling for help. My first thought was, maybe it was some kind of prank, some trick someone set up for hikers like me to find. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I could feel the dread pooling in my stomach. I picked up the phone and pressed the power button to see what else I could find. The screen flickered and then showed the last dialed number. There was no name, just a number. I tried to remember if I knew it, but nothing came to mind. The phone had a dead spot for signal where I was, so I couldn't even make a call myself. I just stared at it, feeling like I was being watched. I looked back around the area, but everything was still. Too still. The kind of quiet where even the air seems to hold its breath. Then, the phone buzzed. Not much, just a slight vibration, but enough to make me jump. I didn't know what to expect, but when I looked at the screen again, my blood ran cold. A message came through, just one word. It said, "Help." I don't know why, but I immediately swiped open the messages. The last one that had been sent was from the same number that had made the emergency call. It was a short, frantic message. "I'm lost. They're still out there. I can hear them." I didn't know what to make of it. Who were they? What did that even mean? I almost dropped the phone when the call timer hit 0 and the screen blinked to show a new message. It was a photo. A blurry, dark photo, but there was no mistaking what it was. It was a picture of a tent. But not any tent, it was my tent. I didn't know how it was possible, but that was definitely my tent. I knew because of the bright blue sleeping bag I had left outside when I'd set it up earlier in the day. I looked around the woods again, but there was no sign of anyone. No other hikers, no movement in the trees. I felt completely alone. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting. The kind of feeling that creeps into the back of your mind and tells you something isn't right. I stepped back, trying to keep my breathing even, but my pulse was racing. I didn't know if I should call the number back or if I should just drop the phone and run. I wanted to leave. I wanted to go home. But I couldn't, not now. Not after everything I had seen. I looked at the phone again, debating what to do. Then, before I could make a decision, the phone vibrated again. This time, there was no message. Just another photo. A photo of the path leading to my campsite. It was taken from what looked like just behind the trees, but there was no one in sight. I couldn't see anything in the photo that stood out, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't handle it anymore. My hands were shaking, and I didn't know what to do. I wanted to go back to the campsite, pack up, and leave, but at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to go back. Not after seeing those pictures. Not after hearing the phone buzz again, as if it was waiting for me to respond. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I was already deep into the woods, far from anyone. And if someone had been watching me, no. I shook my head. I was letting my imagination get the better of me. I thought about taking the phone with me, but I didn't want to carry something that might just drag me deeper into whatever mess I had stumbled into. I made up my mind. I was going to leave it. I set the phone back under the rock, where I found it, trying to bury it deeper. I didn't know if that was the right thing to do, but it felt like the only choice. I turned and began walking quickly back to the campsite, my heart thumping in my chest, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been out there, that they were still out there, and they knew exactly where I was. I couldn't stop thinking about the picture of my tent. How long had they been watching me? I didn't look back as I made my way down the trail. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until I finally reached my campsite. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the tent. Everything was as I left it. The bag was still outside, and nothing seemed disturbed. But I couldn't calm down. I had to get out of there. I packed up everything I could as quickly as possible, grabbing what I could and just throwing it into my pack. I didn't care if it was messy. I had to leave. It wasn't until I was walking out of the woods, every step feeling heavier than the last, that I finally felt like I could breathe again. I never found out who owned that phone, or who sent those messages. And to be honest, I don't want to. I haven't gone back to that place. I don't know if I ever will. But the worst part? Every now and then, I still get that feeling. The one where I feel like I'm being watched. Like someone's waiting for me to make a mistake. I haven't been able to shake that feeling since. I had been hiking for a couple of days, deep in the park, alone, just trying to get away from everything. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, a bit of solitude to clear my mind. I hadn't seen many other hikers, just a few people here and there, and it felt nice to be off the beaten path for once. I was in a remote section of the park, somewhere not too far from the main trails, but far enough to feel like I was on my own. It was the third day when it happened, and I was heading down a narrow trail that cut through the woods. The sun was starting to dip low, casting everything in this orange glow. I was feeling good, enjoying the quiet, when I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just another hiker, right? But then I heard them get closer, and I turned around to see a man standing there. He was wearing a ranger uniform, the green pants, the shirt with the park's logo, and the ranger hat. He was tall, about my height, and had a clean, serious face. He didn't look out of place at all, but something about the way he stood there, just watching me, felt off. I don't know why, but the first thing I noticed was how still he was. Like he was waiting for me to speak first. I said, "Hey, there." He didn't respond right away. He just nodded and then said, "You need to be careful. There have been reports of bears in this area. Stay alert." It wasn't anything I hadn't heard before. There were often warnings about wildlife in the park, especially bears. I've hiked here enough to know to keep my distance from them. I nodded, half paying attention, and said something like, "Yeah, thanks for the heads up." The ranger then took a step closer, his eyes locking on mine, and he said, "Be sure to keep your food packed away. Don't leave anything out at night. Bears are attracted to the smell of food. If you're careful, you'll be fine." It was a bit more intense than the usual warnings, but I didn't think too much about it. People have their way of giving advice, especially park rangers. I thanked him and started walking again, hearing the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. I looked back after a few steps and saw that he was still standing there, watching me. It struck me as strange, but I just kept walking. The sun was going down fast now, and I was getting close to the spot where I'd set up camp the night before. As I walked, my mind wandered. I thought about what the ranger had said about bears. I'd heard about bear sightings in the park before, but it didn't feel like a big deal. I had my bear spray with me, and I always kept my food in a bear canister. Nothing to worry about. I reached my campsite shortly after and spent the rest of the evening setting up my tent, cooking a simple dinner, and enjoying the quiet. It was a clear night, and the stars above were so bright that it felt like I could reach out and touch them. For a while, I forgot about everything, the stress from work, the mess I'd left behind, all of it. But as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the image of the ranger. It wasn't just that he'd warned me about the bears, but the way he stood there, watching me as I walked away. It was like he was waiting for something, like he knew more than he was telling me. I told myself I was overthinking it. I was out here alone, in the woods. Of course, my mind was going to wander. The next day, I decided to take a different route, heading deeper into the forest. I hiked for a while, and by midday, I'd completely forgotten about the ranger encounter. That was, until I ran into a small group of other hikers near the trailhead. We stopped and chatted for a bit. It wasn't much, just small talk about the weather and the trail conditions. One of the hikers mentioned seeing a bear earlier that morning, and I told them about the ranger's warning. Yeah, I just spoke with him yesterday, I said. He was out there giving me the whole spiel about bears and food safety. Really serious about it. The other hikers looked at me like I had two heads. One of them, a woman in her mid-30s, laughed nervously. That's funny, she said. We didn't see any rangers out here today. You sure it was a ranger? I frowned. Yeah, I'm sure. He was wearing the uniform, the whole thing. What, you don't think he was one? She shrugged, but the guy next to her spoke up. There's no ranger working this trail. Not right now, anyway. They're all stationed over by the main areas for the summer rush. You didn't see anyone else, did you? I wasn't sure what to make of that. It didn't sit right with me. I remember the uniform, the way he talked, everything about him seemed like a ranger, except now, according to these hikers, he wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't bring it up again, but felt something cold creeping into my stomach. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe I had just imagined it. But it didn't make sense. I decided to swing by the ranger station when I got back to camp. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but I had to ask. That evening, after packing up and hiking back, I went to the ranger station near the main entrance to the park. I approached the front desk and told the ranger on duty about my encounter earlier in the week. I mentioned the man in the uniform, the warning about the bears, and how he'd seemed a little off. The ranger behind the desk didn't say anything at first. Then he looked at me, his brow furrowed. You're sure about the description? You're sure he looked like a park ranger? Yeah, I said. He was in full uniform, khaki pants, the green shirt, the hat. Everything. The ranger behind the desk looked down at his computer and typed something in. He glanced back at me, then at his screen, then back at me again. There's no record of anyone matching the description working in this park, he said slowly. Not right now, anyway. All our seasonal rangers are assigned to the main areas. You're positive he was a ranger? I nodded, now feeling a little unsettled. He gave me specific advice about bears and keeping food locked up. I'm telling you, he was a ranger. The ranger at the desk shook his head, almost like he was trying to figure out if I was lying. I didn't know why I'd make it up, but at that point, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I'll make a note of it, he said, still looking at his screen. But I've been here a while, and I can tell you for sure no one by that description is working right now. Not in this area. You should be careful out there, though. If you're ever unsure, make sure you call in. We're always around. I left the station feeling colder than when I entered. The whole thing was starting to feel like a bad dream, a dream where I had no control. I couldn't figure out what had happened, but it didn't sit right. I'd met a ranger, or at least someone who looked like one. But now, no one else had seen him. It was like I was the only one who had encountered him. I don't know what it means. I don't know if I'll ever know. But that man in the uniform, he wasn't supposed to be there. I'm sure of it. And I can't shake the feeling that I was being watched the whole time. A few months ago, my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip to a national park that was a few hours outside of the city. We'd been planning the trip for weeks, just a weekend getaway to get away from work and everything. None of us had been to this particular park before, but the reviews online said it was a beautiful spot, remote enough to feel secluded, but still well kept and easy to navigate. The first couple of days were perfect. We set up camp in a small, quiet area near a stream. The weather was good, no bugs to speak of, and we were all in high spirits. We spent the days hiking the trails, lounging around the campfire at night, and just enjoying being outdoors. It felt like the perfect escape. It was the third evening when things started to feel off. We just finished dinner and were sitting around the campfire when one of my friends, Sarah, pointed up toward the trees. "Is that a camera?" she asked, squinting into the fading light. We all looked in the direction she was pointing, but at first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed a small black object tied to one of the tree branches. It wasn't huge, maybe the size of a small coffee can, but it was clearly a trail camera. The kind people use to monitor wildlife. "That's weird," I said. "Who would put that up here?" "Maybe it's for wildlife tracking?" Tom suggested. "This place is pretty remote. Maybe they have a system set up to monitor animals." That made sense, and we let it go. But then, about 20 minutes later, Sarah spotted another one. It was a bit farther away, tied up in a different tree, just outside the perimeter of our campsite. This one was a little higher up, but again, it looked like a trail camera. "Why are there two cameras?" Sarah asked, her voice a little more tense now. We all agreed that it was strange, but we tried to brush it off. After all, it was a national park. Maybe it was part of some wildlife monitoring program. We didn't think much of it at the time. But after we finished up by the campfire, we decided to head to bed, and that's when I started to get a strange feeling. The tents were set up not far from each other, and we all went inside to get some sleep. It wasn't until I was lying in my sleeping bag, just starting to drift off, that I heard something. It was the faint sound of a click, like a camera shutter. I tried to ignore it at first, but then I heard it again. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it or not, but it was enough to make my heart start to race. I lay there for a few minutes, just listening, but the sounds of the woods drowned it out. Maybe it was an animal or some kind of insect. Whatever it was, I couldn't tell. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. The next morning, we got up and went about our usual routine. We had breakfast, packed up a small day bag, and decided to take a hike around the area. But before we left, we all agreed that we should check those cameras, just to be sure. When we got to the trees, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The two cameras were still there, exactly where we'd seen them the night before. As we walked closer, we noticed that one of the cameras was slightly angled downward, as if it had been moved recently. We didn't waste any time. Tom pulled out his knife and carefully cut the string that was holding one of the cameras to the tree. He handed it to me, and we all crowded around, trying to get the memory card out. We couldn't help but feel like we were trespassing, even though it was in the middle of a public park. But curiosity got the better of us, and we weren't about to just leave it there. I slipped the memory card into my camera, and we all gathered around to look at the photos. The first few were of the trail, just a few random shots, maybe from the previous day or earlier in the morning. But as we scrolled further, our stomachs dropped. The next photo was of our campsite. It was taken at the exact moment we arrived the day before, just as we were setting up the tents. The camera angle was high, looking down on us as we unloaded our gear. My face went pale as I realized that this was the exact spot where we had been, and the photo had been taken just after we arrived. There were more photos after that, each one showing us moving around the campsite. Tom was by the fire, Sarah was unloading the cooler, and I was setting up my tent. The photos weren't quick snapshots. They were clear, detailed, and taken at regular intervals. "Someone's been watching us," Sarah said in a shaky voice, her eyes wide as she looked at the screen. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The thought of someone being close, someone watching us without us knowing, made my stomach churn. We scrolled through more photos, and the pattern was the same. Every picture was taken from different angles, all showing us at various points in the day. The more we looked, the more the sense of unease grew. Tom, trying to remain calm, muttered, "This doesn't make any sense. Who would do this?" I didn't have an answer. We decided to go check the second camera, the one farther away from our site, and when we did, we found the same thing. The photos were all of us, our camp, taken from a high angle, from somewhere in the trees. The realization hit us all at once. Whoever had set up these cameras had been watching us since the moment we arrived. And they weren't just observing from a distance, they knew exactly where we were, what we were doing, when we were doing it. I was the one to speak first. "We need to leave. Now." None of us hesitated. We packed up as fast as we could, gathering all our things, not even taking time to properly break down the camp. I don't think any of us wanted to stick around to find out who was behind those cameras. We didn't stick around to look for anything else. We left the park early, driving back to the city in near silence, all of us too shaken to speak. The whole way home, I couldn't shake the images of those photos, the thought of someone watching us from the trees, and I still wonder if the person who set up those cameras is still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to wander into their view. The worst part? I still don't know who was behind it. We reported it to the park rangers when we got back, but they never got back to us with any answers. There's still no explanation for what happened or who was watching us. It's been a while since that trip, but every time I go camping now, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched again. And I'm not sure I'll ever be able to shake that feeling. I went on a solo hiking trip last summer. It had been a long time since I'd had a break from work, and I figured it was time to get out of the city for a while, clear my head, and do something that would give me some space. A long trail up in the mountains seemed like a good idea. It was about a 5-day hike, a decent stretch of wilderness with enough isolation to get away from it all. The kind of thing where you can disconnect and just focus on the scenery, your thoughts, and the sound of nature. The first few days were beautiful. The weather was perfect, the trail wasn't too difficult, and I was feeling good. I was taking my time, enjoying the solitude, and really getting into the rhythm of the hike. I passed a few people here and there, but it wasn't crowded by any means. It was mostly quiet except for the occasional rustling of the trees or birds overhead. Everything felt peaceful. I hadn't been alone like that in a long time, and I was starting to appreciate the stillness. But on the third day, things started to feel off. That's when I first saw him. I had been walking for a few hours, and I had just taken a break by the side of the trail to drink some water and eat a snack. I wasn't in a hurry. I just sat there for a while, soaking in the view. When I started packing up to continue, I saw a man walking toward me from behind, coming around a bend in the trail. He was walking briskly, but didn't look like he was carrying anything, no backpack, no gear. Just a plain jacket and pants, and he looked strange. Like he wasn't supposed to be there. His movements were quick, almost too quick, like he was trying to keep up, but not quite. He didn't seem to be struggling, but it struck me as odd that he wasn't carrying any water or supplies. Most people who hike these trails at least have a small backpack with essentials, right? But this guy didn't even have that. He didn't even seem to notice me sitting there. As he passed by, I looked up and nodded at him, trying to be polite. "Hey," I said, offering a smile. "Nice day for a hike, huh?" He didn't answer. He just kept walking, his eyes focused straight ahead. I thought it was weird, but people hike at different paces, right? Maybe he was deep in his own head. Whatever. I stood up, dusted myself off, and kept going too. About an hour later, I stopped again at a small stream to refill my water bottle. I was kneeling down by the bank when I heard footsteps approaching from behind. I turned my head, and there he was again, the same man. This time he was closer than before, and he didn't even seem to slow down when he saw me. He just walked right past me, again without saying a word. I stood there, watching him, a bit puzzled. There wasn't a reason for him to be following this particular stretch of trail, not with no gear, no food, nothing. The area I was in wasn't particularly scenic, so it didn't make sense that someone would be out here without any real purpose. But I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just someone passing through. Some people are strange when they're out in the woods, but it wasn't like he was doing anything directly wrong. I decided to keep my pace, thinking I'd just get to my next campsite for the night. But then, it started happening more and more frequently. No matter how far I hiked, no matter how much ground I covered, he always seemed to be behind me. Every time I stopped to rest or check my map, I'd see him coming up the trail. No gear. No water. Nothing. Just walking fast, always with that same blank expression. At first, I thought maybe it was just a coincidence. But by the end of the fourth day, I started to get the sense that this was no accident. Something wasn't right. He never spoke to me, never asked for directions or even acknowledged me in any way. He just kept walking, and each time I looked back, he was there. It was starting to make me feel uneasy. That night, when I set up camp, I kept checking over my shoulder, convinced I'd hear footsteps in the distance. But there was nothing. It was still. Too still, almost. I couldn't sleep. Every time I heard the wind rustling through the trees, I'd tense up. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somewhere nearby, watching. Maybe he'd been following me this whole time, maybe even from the very beginning. It was just the kind of thing you couldn't fully explain. By the fifth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if something was really wrong, but I couldn't keep walking without knowing who this guy was and why he was following me. I made my way toward the closest exit from the trail, trying to hurry, but the whole time I felt him behind me. I kept hearing those footsteps. Soft, steady. Never speeding up. Never stopping. I don't know why I didn't turn around to confront him. Maybe I was afraid. I had a gut feeling something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint it. So, I just kept going, hoping I'd reach the end of the trail and the parking lot soon. As I approached the exit of the trailhead, I turned one last time to look behind me. And there he was. He was standing in the distance, just at the edge of the trees, watching me. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to acknowledge that I saw him. He was just standing there, staring, as if waiting for something. Waiting for me to do something. I didn't stop. I didn't look back after that. I just kept walking, faster now, and I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. I never saw him again after that, and I've never told anyone about the feeling I had on that hike, about the way he just kept appearing behind me. I don't know what his intentions were, but something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't normal. Looking back, I wonder if I was just being paranoid. But even now, when I think about that trail, I feel the weight of that feeling, like someone was there, just out of sight, watching me the whole time. I've always been someone who enjoys the peace of nature. There's something about being in the wilderness, away from everything, that lets me disconnect and recharge. That's why I decided to go on a solo camping trip a few months ago. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, 3 days in the woods, a little backpacking, and a lot of quiet time by the fire. I thought it would be the perfect way to clear my head. The first day was peaceful enough. I set up my camp by a small creek, a quiet spot that felt untouched. I spent the afternoon hiking around the area, gathering firewood, and just taking in the fresh air. It was exactly what I needed. As the sun began to set, I cooked my dinner and settled by the fire. The sky was clear, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I felt safe. Alone, but content. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing something in the distance. It was faint at first, so I brushed it off as the wind or an animal moving through the trees. But then I heard it again. A whistle. Soft and distant. It was only 3 notes, and it repeated every few minutes. The same 3 notes over and over. It was an eerie sound, but I didn't think too much of it. It could have been someone else camping nearby, or maybe an animal making a strange noise. I tried to shake it off and focus on falling asleep, but the sound persisted. It was getting under my skin, though I couldn't explain why. Something about it just felt wrong. There was a rhythm to it, but it wasn't natural. I lay awake for what felt like hours, straining to hear the whistle each time it came. Every few minutes, the 3 notes would cut through the stillness of the night, and each time it did, my stomach would tighten. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I was just imagining things. I'd gotten a little too worked up over nothing, I thought. The day was bright and clear, and I spent it hiking through the trails, enjoying the solitude. It wasn't until the second night that the whistling returned. It was exactly the same, 3 notes over and over, repeating in the same pattern as before. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I told myself it was probably just someone else on the trail. After all, I wasn't the only one out there. But when it happened the third night, I was no longer sure. By this time, I was beginning to feel the weight of being alone out there. The whistling didn't stop. It wasn't like a human whistle that might come from a person walking by. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. The same 3 notes, as though whoever or whatever was making the sound knew exactly what they were doing. I began to wonder if it was some kind of signal. Was it someone trying to communicate? Was it meant for me? My mind raced with possibilities, and none of them were comforting. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Each time the whistle came, it seemed closer. I started thinking about the layout of the area around me, how the trees were thick, how the creek was at the bottom of a little ravine, and how I hadn't seen anyone all day. I realized there was no way it could be another camper who was close enough to make that sound without me hearing them earlier. I was starting to panic. I wanted to pack up and leave, but the thought of walking through the dark woods with no clear sense of what was going on terrified me. By the 4th night, I had enough. I decided that I wasn't going to wait around to find out what was making the sound, so I packed up my tent and all my gear and hiked out of the area. It was still dark, but the whistling had stopped, at least for the time being. My heart was pounding as I made my way toward the trailhead, and I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station. I went straight to the desk and spoke to one of the rangers who was on duty. I must have looked pretty shaken up because he gave me a curious look and asked if I was all right. "I've been camping out in the backcountry for a few days," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And I kept hearing this whistling every night. It was the same 3 notes over and over. It sounded really close, but I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I'm not sure what it was." The ranger's expression didn't change. He looked at me for a moment, and then he just nodded. "That's happened before," he said. "Several people have reported hearing the same thing, especially around that area. The whistling, the same 3 notes, always in the middle of the night. It's been going on for years, actually. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Years? I repeated, my voice cracking. You mean other people have heard it too? What is it? The ranger didn't have an immediate answer. He just gave me a small, almost sad smile, like he'd seen it all before. We don't know, he said, looking down at some paperwork. We've had a few incidents of people getting spooked by the sound, but we don't have any clear explanation for it. Some people say it's just an animal. Others think it's something else, but nobody's been able to figure it out. I stood there for a few moments, too stunned to speak. It was like he had just confirmed everything I had been thinking, but it didn't make me feel any better. I didn't know if I should be relieved that I wasn't imagining it, or scared that this was something that had been happening for so long with no real answers. I've never heard anything like it before, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Is it dangerous? The ranger looked up at me and shrugged. We've never had any reports of anyone getting hurt because of it. But it sure does unsettle people. We tell hikers to stay aware and report anything strange, but that's about all we can do. I didn't ask any more questions. I felt sick to my stomach, but I was glad to be out of the woods. I didn't want to stay in the area any longer. I went straight to my car and drove back home. I'm still not sure why I heard those nights, but the whistling haunts me. Every time I close my eyes, I can hear those same 3 notes in my head. I'll never forget how it sounded, and I'll never forget how it made me feel like I wasn't alone out there, even though I couldn't see anyone. Now, every time I go camping or hiking, I'm a little more aware of the sounds around me. I don't think I'll ever forget that eerie whistle. And I can't stop wondering if maybe, one day, I'll hear it again.